to the Reno City Planning Commission workshop on Thursday, September 17th, 2020. Can we please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? And Arlo, we haven't seen you in a while. You want to start us off? Unmute.
Would love to. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great. Thank you. Michelle, can we have roll call, please?
Yes. John Marshall?
Here.
Thank you. Peter Gower?
Here.
Mark Johnson?
Here.
Arthur Munoz is absent. Paulo Levis is absent. Alex Felto?
Here. Here.
Kathleen Taylor?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Michelle. Next item is public comment. Michelle, do we have any public comment for any action item or any general public comment?
So we received general public comment, public comment for the item 4.1. We did not receive general public comment. However, we did receive voicemail for item 4.1. Do you want to hear the voicemail prior to opening that item under general public comment, or do you want to wait until after Arlo has done his presentation?
Commissioners, do you have a preference?
Madam Chair, I believe the entire meeting tonight is Arlo's presentation, so I'm not exactly sure how we would incorporate the public comment into that. It might be best to do it beforehand.
Carl, can we do that?
Yes.
Okay, so we have 3 voicemails. So it's just going to be a minute, and we will play those for you.
Hello, my name is Deanne Radcliffe. Today is September 17th, 2020. The item number is 4.1, Zoning Code Renovation. So I am a lifelong resident of Reno. I live in Verdi, and my property adjoins property that will be developed. I would like to provide input regarding the proposed code change update about hours of construction, as my family and I spend much of our time outside in really all seasons except for winter. I understand that change near my property will be happening, and I also recognize that construction happens over years and not overnight. With this in mind, I would like to request that 11 hours, Monday through Friday, is too much. I think that having construction work until 6 p.m. every night is far too long, and would respectfully request that 5 p.m. be the stop time. Likewise, working literally all day on Saturday from 8 to 6 is too long. I would like to suggest that that also be dialed back to 5 p.m. I cannot imagine having 6 days every single week, virtually all the waking hours being impacted by construction. 11 hours, again, is just too much. I support no work on Sundays and also no work on any federal, state, and local holidays. I also feel that enforcement of this should be built in, and rather having to contact code enforcement endlessly, there needs to be a quick one-call option. Again, that's really important to me. Code enforcement is a lovely department, but I contacted them about an issue literally over a 1.5 year period. There needs to be a one-call option. I have heard horror stories of companies that do not comply with their specified hours of construction, and I really strongly feel that by constantly burdening the residents, by having to contact code enforcement, that simply is unfair. Residents of the neighborhoods live there prior to construction. I'm going to live there after construction. The developers will, as we know, come in, they'll build their properties and be gone. So I really, really feel strongly that residents need to be treated at least as well as developers are. Thank you so very much for allowing me to offer my opinion on this vitally important policy. Once again, my name is Deanne Radcliffe, and I'm a Verdi resident. Thank you.
Hello, this is Pam. Pam McNeil, 1990 Evergreen Ridge Court, Reno, Somerset, Sierra Canyon. I think I know most of you, and it's nice to hear that we will be able to do this audibly. I did listen to the public comment section at the Planning Commission meeting last night, and I was very, very, very impressed. I appreciate it. Thank you. I wanted to say, in supplement to my letter that I sent in on why I disagree with, let's see, this is on items, zoning code, renovation 4.1 for tonight, about the hours of construction, and the whole code amendment suggestion list itself. It was very clear written. The languages I can understand. It wasn't like in a whole new separate language, and I appreciate that. I also wanted to say audibly, since we can't talk eye to eye, one of the points that I made in my email is the frustration with the lack of enforcement. Previously, we had Code Enforcement Officer Joe Henry, and he would respond on weekends and on holidays. Now, if the only enforcement we have is Reno Direct, it's very limiting. Which is very frustrating. Anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. I cannot see giving an extra holiday to the builders to work. I mean, seriously, you sit there and you listen to the beep, beep, beep constantly, as well as all the construction people and equipment. Anyway, enough said. Thank you very, very much for your knowledge. I admire it, and I appreciate all the time that the Planning Commissioners put in, as well as all the direction of the staff, and that's just overwhelming too. But thank you for this opportunity. Pam.
Good morning. My name is Perry Terrio. I live in Sierra Canyon in Somerset. I am making a comment about today's Planning Commission meeting on the Reno Zoning Code renovation. Thank you for considering my comments in regards to the zoning code update. I live in an area where residential construction has been taking place for years, and the hours allowed for construction is very important. It is very disruptive to have the noise and the kicked up dust throughout most of our waking hours. Yes, I do understand that they need to work, but there's got to be some compromise and consideration and respect for those affected. And you also need to use common sense. Plus, agreed upon hours must be followed regardless of whether or other types of impact like rain, snow, whatever. I believe that construction includes grading, road construction, building, landscaping, any use of equipment. I would like to see hours Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. And I would like to see Saturday hours, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and absolutely no construction on Sunday or state and federal holidays. There is absolutely no reason why anybody should be doing construction on those days. So I believe this is more than reasonable. And once again, I appreciate you considering my comments and my request. Have a safe and lovely day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Michelle. Is that all?
Yes, that is it.
Great. Moving on to item 4.1, the moment we've all been waiting for, the zoning code renovation update.
Good evening, Commissioners. Sorry, our technical difficulties delayed our start. For the record, my name is Arlo Stockham, Community Development Director and Acting Assistant Manager. What we had planned today, if it's acceptable to the chair and the group, is basically to break up this review process into two parts. We don't want to do a repeat of the lengthy presentation, boring everyone to death, but I do have a fairly abbreviated presentation, maybe about 10 minutes on the first sections, and with a focus on highlighting the input we've been receiving as recently as just up to a few minutes ago. I want to emphasize that this is not the last review. We're planning the initial review for chapters 1 through 4. We continue to get feedback, and some of that is on chapters 1 through 4. So we're planning at your future meetings to kind of do a go back on any additional items you want us to look at. Also any new recommendations that have emerged before we move into the second half of the initial code review. So if that's acceptable for the group, I could dive right into a fairly brief presentation and then open it up for the workshop here.
Sounds good.
Okay, give me one moment here to share my screen. There's just a little bit of repetition in here, mainly for those watching at home who haven't seen the overview presentation, but it's really kept to a minimum. See if I can advance properly. So the review steps we were planning is initially to do chapters 1 through 3. We've really received very little comment in this round of review on those, and then review chapter 1804, the development standards, which we have received more comments on, especially on a few specific topics. Those of you on the commission know, but as a reminder to everyone, the real big picture balance here is to implement the master plan, which includes a number of new design provisions calling for quality of the design, sustainable design, and multimodal transportation options, together with making the code much easier to use. It's very cumbersome right now, and also enhancing predictability and transparency through the development review process. These were council priorities and master plan implementation priorities, got delayed slightly due to COVID, but we're ready to resume. This is the tail end of the planning process. Every successful process needs a start, middle, and an end, and we're moving towards the end. I do want to emphasize, though, that this isn't, update a code once and we're done. There's going to be a whole series of follow-up steps. In terms of this review, we are at the first of 2 Planning Commission review meetings or workshops where we're really seeking your feedback on adjustments to make to the draft that's currently out for review. We have this meeting scheduled and your next meeting scheduled for that. We have reviewed the entire document with the technical working group. We've also completed 3 Zoom public presentations. Thank you, Commissioner Taylor, for attending last night. So you heard the overview presentation. So all of your recommendations will then be going to the City Council. They'll have a similar process, and then the outcome of that will come back to go through the adoption process. You may recall we have some reference documents. Exhibit B is the summary of code amendments. Exhibit C is a listing of the public input we've received. And Exhibit D, which we distributed a supplemental update to, are the recommended changes to the current draft that are available for your review. So whatever changes this body recommends, we would integrate into that Exhibit D to bring forward to the subsequent review steps. Certainly there are topics outside the scope of the amendments in this document that we discussed in detail earlier in the process. It's really pretty much too late to add very big new topics. So, that potential future amendment list, if we want to get into entirely new issues, is really the recommended way to do that. Also, map amendment reviews will occur subsequent to the code update. And we do plan a regular check-in, review, refine process following adoption. When you do a comprehensive update like this, there's bound to be some glitches here and there. So we want to continue to review and refine this as we move forward. So in terms of the document itself, we'll be reviewing chapters 1 through 4. At the next meeting, we'll return to any outstanding items and then review the balance of the code. Really addressing a number of our key issues that are under discussion through this process. received a lot of comments on the sustainability ordinance and a couple other topics, and fewer comments or fewer concerns on other sections of code. So I'll focus on those areas where we have been getting feedback through this round of the process. Our general provisions, we really haven't received any concerns about. We refined this from the prior draft. There's one clarification noted in the table of amendments, but that's a non-substantive kind of clarification of language. So I won't spend a lot of time there. Certainly the commission may have questions or recommendations, but at this point, we don't have any substantive changes being recommended to this body at this time. Similarly, on our zoning district chapter, Exhibit D has, I think, one typo cleanup, but no substantive amendments recommended at this point. The big changes here are organizational, a much easier format to use, and then also the consolidation of the mixed-use districts. We have been receiving a number of comments kind of from specific areas associated with consolidation of the districts. I think we have one amendment recommended that'll actually go in Chapter 3, dealing with a fairly unique area on East 4th Street and a mix of industrial and mixed uses in that area. And we've had discussions in a couple other areas and maybe bringing forward some nuanced recommendations to address some property owner input we've been getting. The real changes here, the consolidations go to fairly comparable zoning districts. It's really just that, a consolidation. The two main changes are the two downtown districts, the University District and the Pounding District. We made significant amendments to the Pounding District standards from the prior draft. And to date, we've received a lot of questions about that area, but no concerns or recommended changes. I think we pretty well addressed the concerns with the prior draft through the addition of transition areas and kind of fine tuning how much we're going to reduce intensity allowances in that area. Other districts, the residential districts, very minor changes. The basic standards are staying unchanged. The districts are staying unchanged, except for some naming changes, but the setbacks, heights, lot sizes, all that stand unchanged. The changes are a reduction in setbacks from alleys and arterial roads, and also multifamily building separation. We've received a couple comments on this, I think 2 or 3. I think there's a general, there are some people in the community who don't really support the concept of compact, walkable communities, kind of the urban planning smart growth thing, and are focused more on increased setbacks and larger lot sizes and more preservation of development patterns. I think that's a fairly fair characterization of what the recommendations are. In general, we're not changing much. We've also received recommendations mainly during the prior draft to be more aggressive in promoting infill development with reduced setbacks and higher densities. So on balance, we're making few, if any, changes through the text as our recommendation. The issues of housing affordability and looking at opportunities for upzoning or other zoning changes are recommended to be addressed through subsequent neighborhood-specific processes with outreach rather than through wholesale changes to development standards. We haven't really received much of any comments or concerns about the special purpose district changes. I'd say there's support more than anything else for bringing back SPD districts with additional standards. And the PUD district standards were a big topic of discussion at the City Council during the last round of review, but we haven't seen a lot of comments on that during this round of review. Similarly with the overlay districts, a number of questions in relation to the handling of historic landmark overlays, but once kind of understood that this was a simplification of the designation process and not a a removal of the designation. People seem comfortable with that. 1803, our land use table. I did just have a discussion this afternoon. We'll be bringing forward one nuance change recommended to this table at your next meeting. Overall, again, it's largely organizational changes, but there are targeted changes to specific use allowances in the land use table, noted with the green and red shading and highlighting. And the targeted changes to the land uses and use standards. Again, not a lot of comments or concerns on that. The recommendations for adjustments in Exhibit D are primarily clarifications. Probably the couple that went beyond clarifications involve some of the land use specific standards that are written into the draft. The technical working group and staff supports this as well. They felt that was duplicative and in some cases inconsistent with the development standards, the new enhanced standards that apply more broadly to all use types, and that things like maximum square footage of warehouse uses were no longer needed with these more detailed development standards that are generally applicable. So there's a couple refinements to remove standards that were specific to land uses. And what that would revert to, for example, the removal of some language applicable to duplexes, triplexes, et cetera. Those buildings would then be subject to all the same development standards that a single family home or a multifamily home would be subject to, rather than having different and somewhat inconsistent standards. I mentioned the adjustment on East 4th Street, which addressed some property owner concerns out there and effectively retains the existing use allowances. Similarly, a maximum size specific to the warehouse use. That's recommended for removal, and the overall development standards would govern the intensity and pattern of development. Same with wholesale. So wholesale and warehousing had some use-specific limitations that are proposed for removal. I think those are all the recommended changes there. Kept the presentation short because this is really about the planning commissioners and your discussion and recommendations. So I'll be done and open it up. I'm going to close the slides so we can see each other. And then I'll open it up to questions or recommendations.
Okay, thank you, Arlo. Who wants to get started?
I think this will be the easier part of our workshop, and we'll have more with Chapter 4.
Commissioner Gower, did you have some comments?
Just looking for clarification on our approach here. I mean, are we going to go through just throwing out feedback? Are we going to have sort of a section by section discussion? Just looking for a little bit of direction in terms of structure.
I think we're going through are we going through the first 3 chapters now, and then we'll go through Chapter 4 after we have some discussion and comments on these?
That was our plan. If you could bring to our attention anything you want us to look into further, or just any recommendations for changes at this point, that would be most helpful, and then we can bring them back if there are changes at your next meeting.
I have a question for you, Arlo. Thank you for giving the presentation. Has there been any talk about allowing accessory dwelling units for various types of property and putting that into Section 1803?
Yeah, that was, Commissioner, thanks for the question. I think it was before you were on the commission. That was a major topic of debate. When we went through the issue sheet process, we had that discussion. Well, backing up, there was proposed ADU ordinances before I started back with the city that ended up getting denied. We had a discussion about whether to look into a softer approach or revisit the issue. And the direction we received was to leave it alone and essentially leave the standards exactly how they are, which is what this document reflects. It's a big issue in the community as it relates to housing affordability. It's also a big issue as it relates to kind of the character of neighborhoods. At this point, it's a topic to potentially revisit when we look at additional housing amendments, but not proposed for substantive change in this document.
Is this the place where it would be proposed, or is there another section of code? And I understand it's something we would have to discuss and decide upon, but where would it go?
It would go it would go in two places. The zoning district chapter 1802 as allowed land use in certain areas, and then presumably we'd have use-specific standards in 1803. So there could be a change in appetite. Time has passed. Our housing affordability challenges have gotten worse. But council was pretty direct of, please don't open this up with this process now.
Would you, and I know I'm not asking you this off the top of your head, but would it be possible for you to direct me at some point towards some minutes to understand what the council's appetite was?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And, yeah.
Arlo?
John?
John, good evening. Madam Chair, may I go ahead?
Yes.
Thank you. Just first a couple of kind of generic kind of question. You know, there are some kind of overarching policy issues that are involved with the renovation, and you know, one of them is like, you know, where we're going to discuss the balance between what goes to planning commission, what goes to administrator, what goes on appeal that basically misses out, goes around the planning commission. When would you like to have those? I mean, they're not really about anything specific in terms of a number. When would be most productive to have that kind of discussion? When we kind of do the full thing subsequently, or do you want like specific comments right here?
Maybe a little of each. That topic is addressed in our procedures chapter 1808, but especially as we move into the next section of this workshop, chapter 1804, there are some of those kind of package arrangements, like with grading, where we have more detailed development standards with a somewhat streamlined development review process. So I guess I'd suggest bring them up. We may want to return to them at our next meeting, but we really want your feedback so we have time to address it or look into it if we need to.
Okay. I'd like to go now to 1802-105, which is the annexation section, and when you're bringing land into the city. And this really, you don't really have to run for your code. It's really more of a question about, Arlo, we go back a long way, and one of the first things we dealt with was bringing in annexed lands under SPD. And that really, in my view, caused substantial issues with, allowing annexed lands to be coming in as SPD, and then not, that just caused a lot of uncertainty. It caused a lot of uncertainty, particularly with economic analysis and justification for those kind of annexations. And what I liked about getting rid of the SPD was, in part, we got rid of that kind of uncertainty, since SPD is a relatively generic designation. So I guess I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can maintain what we, or avoid that consequence of reviving, resuscitating SPD.
There may be a couple acronyms that are being used interchangeably. You know, the only thing that would come in under an SPD or PUD is if it's an existing specific plan in unincorporated Washoe County. There was a different designation in the master plan called SPA, Special Planning Area.
My mistake.
It's an A, not a D. But there's another provision in here, Commissioner, that I think you may like. There's some language when we get to Chapter 1808 about concurrent review of zoning changes and master plan changes with annexation requests. This was discussed and suggested at the council meeting. There is some opposition to that. There's a little bit of flexibility language where an applicant could justify why they're not doing it. But that kind of got to our recent, one recent application, Evans Ranch, formerly known as Ballardini Ranch. They came in with an annexation request without a master plan or zone change and were a little bit dodgy on their future plans. And council was very uncomfortable annexing that property without knowing kind of what the ultimate development plan was. And that was kind of the example used for this new code language that generally requires consideration of land use changes with annexations. So it's kind of a different framework than it was back in the day.
Okay, if you could send me that language, that'd be terrific, or that code section, if you don't know it off the top of your head. Is it in the
annexation section in 1808?
Okay, 105. I got it.
I'll get it to you here before the end of the night.
The next one I had was, man, it just flew out of my mind, and I didn't write it down. Madam Chair, maybe I can come back to it when I remember what it was I'm going to say. Thank you.
Sounds good, Commissioner Marshall. Other questions? Are we ready to move on to Chapter 4? Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Belto.
Just one other question I wanted to touch base with you on, Arlo, is so I've talked a little bit, I think, with some of the staff about trying to see if there's a way to prevent breed restrictions in our zoning code so that certain animal breeds, if you're building new residential property, it's not possible to enforce a breed restriction that would prevent people from having, say, pit bulls on their property. Have you seen something like that in a permitted uses section for zoning code? And would that be something that could be put into section 18.03?
I might have not heard you correctly, Commissioner. Were you breed restrictions like animals or deed restrictions?
Sorry, breed restrictions. So restricting types of dog breeds, for instance. The result of this, when you have breed restrictions, are that you get certain animals that just sit inside of the animal shelter and never get adopted because people can't take them home.
We do not have breed restrictions currently. I actually would want to research whether we legally could do that if there's an interest. In effect, there's an interlocal agreement where animal control regulations have been, Angela knows it better than I do, are with the animal control department. So we actually delegated some of our regulatory authority, as did Washoe, to that agency. Are you concerned about possible breed restrictions or advocating for them?
I'm concerned with possible breed restrictions. Being someone that's rented, or if you're trying to live in any place, sometimes with an HOA, there are very harsh breed restrictions. And that's something where if we could use the code to prevent that, and other people on the commission were supportive, that's something I would be interested in doing.
Oh, I get it now.
So I don't know if it's possible to say, when you're looking at the residential uses section, there's a lot of affirmative uses that are available by the code. Is it possible to carve out or to put in place a prohibitive use, something you could not do, to prevent that from happening?
I think that's a topic that we would want to discuss with the city attorney's office and potentially research in terms of the legality of that. I don't know off the top of my head if that's allowed, essentially telling a property owner they could not have that type of restriction in their rental. I know it's commonplace. I mean, it also gets into the, you know, a lot of places, no big dogs, but small dogs are okay, and one cat and one, you know, that type of thing. So I don't know, maybe Carl has some ideas right off the top of his head. We could look into it if it's something the commission wanted us to do. Carl, you're on the spot. Is it legal?
I don't expect an answer thoroughly vetted tonight. I'm clearly just asking you off the cuff, but it's something I've been thinking about and interested in, so I would appreciate any insight that you all can give me in the future before our next meeting.
Yeah, we'll take a look at it.
Thank you so much.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Johnson, I have a question for Arlo based on one of the comments that came in today and we touched on it, which was the issue of the setback modification, multifamily, in two cases, I guess, one to match the residential, you know, the single family zoning, and one for arterial. And the explanation you made to me was that it's in an attempt to sort of facilitate the master plan for you know, comments for walkability and that. And maybe you can expand on that, because I'm having a hard time understanding how where the building sits on the property enhances walkability as opposed to actually just increases the available building footprint and from a single family standpoint. And then maybe an example of, you know, a reduction along an arterial as an attempt to increase walkability when, you know, arterials are not typically our neighborhood streets where we're advocating for that.
Yeah, I think my point was more generally on some comments that came in that basically said increase setbacks, increase minimum lot sizes, the general recommendations for much lower density, more spread out development.
Well, no, I know what you're saying. I'm very specifically asking how you're taking these setback things and applying them to walkability.
I was just about to get to that.
Thank you.
There are a few targeted ones. The first one, well, backing up, 90% of the intensity standards are unchanged here. There's people saying increase them. There's people saying decrease them. I'm going to continue. I'm getting there.
I want to, we've got a long night ahead of us. I want a very specific answer to a very specific question as to how reducing a setback increases walkability. That's
you get more compact development that by its nature is closer together and more walkable. The textbook sprawl is kind of low density, large lots, and properties are spread out to an extent that walking is not as feasible. So it's really, do we promote kind of the more compact development patterns or a more spread out pattern where uses are further away and greater separated? I think the point I was trying to make is we're not making substantial changes. The real nature of the changes are alley setbacks being reduced to what they were when the properties were originally subdivided. The reduction in alley setbacks, you know, properties are built out with buildings right up against alleys, and that was allowed when they were built. And then subsequent to that, codes were adopted that required a 20-foot setback or a front yard setback from alleys. So most of the properties that have alleys are existing non-conforming to the current setbacks, and this change brings that back. The other specific change is on arterials. The old ordinance required, I believe it was a 30-foot setback from arterials, which is very typical for our kind of suburban development pattern with, you know, arterials are the roadways we drive on and, you know, no walkability. But when you look at our map, all of our downtown and other mixed-use urban development is located along an arterial. So if we maintain that, we're requiring 30-foot setback from Virginia Street and Center Street. We have exceptions, but again, bringing those buildings up closer to the street was recommended to increase utilization and really to have more of a pedestrian atmosphere, not a a highway suburban driving type of atmosphere. Those are two very specific changes. And the third one is the multifamily building separation. This is interior to a project. So right now we have different, it's a very minor change actually. We have different separation standards depending on how many units in a building. And a number of people represented that those separation standards were an impediment to utilizing their property fully, and that we should just go with the smaller separation standard within projects. This isn't exterior setbacks. So those are really the three. I think we had one other where there was, I don't know what reason, I think one of the multifamily districts had a larger setback, like 15 feet, but all the other districts were 10 feet, if I recall correctly. And we made them all consistent at 10 feet because multifamily is supposed to be higher density. I think it was just a relic from prior amendments where it wasn't cleaned up, like all the other districts were brought to 10 feet and one stayed at 15. So this brings them all to consistency. So those are kind of the targeted changes. Hope it answers your question.
Okay, so I understand the internal setback question. That wasn't a concern. So can you specifically state, so are the setbacks for multifamily to match single family, is that all four sides or just the front yard setback?
Just the front. Jeff, do you have in front of you which zone that is? I could look it up. Was it MF 14? And it was just the front, as I recall.
You were talking about what got changed to 10 feet, or?
Yeah, I think we did was it a 15 to a 10?
Jeff, I'm trying to understand the statement in the code information that's presented is that the multifamily setbacks were, front yard setback was adjusted to meet the single family setback. And I'm trying to understand two things. Was it just the front yard setback or was it all setbacks? How much the change was in that setback if it's going from, 20 feet to 10 feet. And then I think Arlo, explained, although not entirely on just the front yard setback.
I have your answer. It's the MS 14 district only, and it changed the front setback only from 15 feet to 10 feet to match the setback required in all of our other residential districts.
Okay, so thank you. That was, so basically, to clear up that code item question that I had, it's multifamily 14, a 5-foot change in setback, and then multifamily typical across the board for arterial commercial from 30 foot to 20 foot?
What this draft does is on the multifamily, it's arterial roadways. We had a supplemental setback along arterial roadways, and that's proposed to be eliminated, so the same setback standards would apply whether you're abutting a collector or an arterial road.
Okay. Thank you, Arlo.
Thank you.
So Arlo, I have some general, general questions that have come in through email and calls. I'm just going to wait until the end, if that's okay, to kind of go over everything, if that's appropriate. One of the things that you just talked about was the building separation is going to 10 feet, and it used to be 20 feet and 10 feet. And if you could just, I think you had the explanation, and I might have zipped over it, but is it because it's maximizing people's property rights, or what's the reason for that, if you don't mind?
Yeah, essentially it allows greater property utilization in a location that's interior to a property and not, up against a neighbor. And there were questions about why do we base the different separation on the number of units within the building. That also kind of discourages the more affordable housing types that are typically smaller units and bump up against those unit counts. I keep coming back to our current code treats a 4,000 square foot penthouse the same as a 600 square foot studio. And this is just one minor tweak to help augment affordable housing without impacts on neighboring properties. It's a very minor nuance change.
Okay, and was there any concern from fire or EMS or anybody for access, emergency?
You know, because the 10 feet, it could be the exact same building, and it's only, the only difference is how many units are inside of it. So the 10 feet was fine for all public safety, all purposes. It's already allowed for different use types. You could do office towers that close together. It was only multifamily uses where we had this supplemental separation.
Okay,
I
thank you.
will note too, Commissioner Taylor, that the fire code also comes into play no matter what development comes in, and they're still required to meet fire separation for any type of building. So from a public safety standpoint, that'll still be required to be met, regardless of what the setbacks are.
Great.
It brings up a basic philosophy that the technical working group spent a lot of time on of, you know, how do we help with affordability in ways that don't impact kind of the development patterns or the neighbors who may feel negatively impacted by intensity? So there was a lot of seeking, you know, interior to projects. Could we do this? The alleys, and there was also in conjunction with this, the new step-back standards that actually increase the setback as buildings get taller on the perimeter of properties. So this was one, you know, fairly targeted minor change that was consistent with a broader philosophy of balancing affordability with neighborhood character.
Great, thank you. Other questions, commissioners, before we move on? Okay, thanks, Arlo. You're up again.
So we're done with 1803. Okay. One moment, please. We're getting into more substantive stuff here where we have received comments. So I'm going to take us back to the PowerPoint. The development standards section, which is the balance of our meeting tonight, organized really from the ground up. I'm going to focus on where we're getting a lot of comments, but also probably another 5 or 10 minute overview here. So natural resource protection is generally outside the scope of this. Things like flood hazards and drainage ways were scoped earlier in the process to be addressed through distinct processes. A few very targeted revisions here. We do continue to get feedback from some suggesting significant changes to drainage ways, wetlands, things of that nature. You know, at this point, it would be pretty hard to do really major amendments and have a proper process, but that is very likely to be one of the earlier projects initiated post-update. This residential shadowing amendment is, I know the shadowing code is very sensitive. There were an amendment passed not that long ago related to shadowing of parks. This is different. This is very nuanced. It's only the shadowing of buildings. What we have is, again, I think it's just a cleanup that wasn't done. MF21 and MF30 both allow 45-foot buildings, but our shadowing code says a building can't shadow if it's over 35 feet. So in effect, we have a 35-foot height standard in a district where 45 feet's allowed, except in certain areas at the edge of the district where it doesn't abut against the same district. So that's really what this cleans up to allow MF buildings of that height to shadow other MF buildings of that height. Another of a very targeted suite of amendments trying to find opportunities for affordable housing that aren't impactful. The codification of the retention requirement in our closed basins, we've been doing that condition by condition. That would be codified. And the source water protection ordinance is essentially a notification process. Someone is interested in putting in resources to help monitoring potentially polluting uses near drinking water supplies. There's no new regulations here. It's a notification. Someone's going to be monitoring and bringing in NDP when they see violations. Article 2 is a big one. It's interesting in these processes, oftentimes, 90% of the comments are on 10% of the topics, and the sustainability ordinance is one of those topics. I think we should spend some more time on that sustainability ordinance. Maybe I can go through the rest of this chapter. I would say it's the number one topic for comments we're receiving. We've had follow-up meetings. We have some refinements we distributed. Ultimately, this is a policy decision of how stringent or not stringent this ordinance should be. So we can come back to that after this overview presentation. Grading in Hillside, to Commissioner Marshall's point earlier, this is one topic where the process has some targeted streamlining, and the development standards are significantly more, especially the slope treatment standards and hillside architecture standards. This generated a lot of concern, the initial draft from the development community, that these standards may be too rigid and may interfere with what could be quality design. So the workout was an additional provision where someone could go through the full public hearing process to propose a project that exceeded the new enhanced development standards. That would be done through a public hearing at the Planning Commission, a major site plan review process. We really haven't received much of anything in this round on this material, but it was a big discussion topic during the last round of review. We haven't received much of anything in terms of concerns on Articles 5 and 6, the expanded residential sidewalk requirements, and the new connectivity standards. This also had some significant refinements. There were a number of concerns that it was too stringent. It stays pretty stringent, but it has, targeted changes to address the concerns that were raised. Parking was a major discussion topic during the last round. Following the council review, we made some refinements. We kept the general structure of a geographically tiered parking requirements intact, moving away from the project-by-project parking analyses that occur now. We've received very little concern or comment on this. It was endorsed, really all of this was endorsed by the technical working group, except the sustainability ordinance. They basically said, hey, we have internal disagreements, this is a policy choice. So the parking standards, again, downtown, no minimum parking like most urban areas have, and then level 1, level 2 parking in transition areas. We have received some input, especially just this week, on the trip reduction ordinance. We had a meeting just today with NAOP, and they were a little bit concerned with more with that some of the requirements involve ongoing operations and the administration of that. I think they were recommending pushing it off the business license code. This was worked out with RTC. It's a pretty flexible ordinance. It's something that this body's been conditioning on many projects. There's flexibility, but still requirements to have some trip reduction provisions for large employers. That's probably the major comments we've gotten at this point. I guess we got a number of emails of support for the parking changes, but the trip reduction standards have been kind of the ongoing discussion item, especially this week. I should back up and mention that, sometimes it takes a process getting near the end to bring people out. We've got much more comments this week after the staff report was published than earlier. So we will likely have some items to return to at your next meeting once we have a chance to vet through these newly received recommendations. Landscaping, most folks seem pretty comfortable with. I don't think we had any suggested changes to the landscape code. The suite that originally was recommended by the Committee of Landscape Architects to promote better tree growth and more shade canopy, smaller trees at planting, enhanced tree well and soil preparation standards, and expanded parking lot landscape standards being the biggies. Remarkably, I thought we were going to get a lot of feedback on the site and building design standards. We did during the last round, had a lot of discussion, made a lot of refinements, and overall, at least so far, most folks seem comfortable with them. They're more detailed design standards for projects, differentiating residential, mixed use, and non-residential areas. This is kind of the section of code that really implements the structure plan, where there's a different development pattern called out in ordinance for our different areas of the community. I do want to call out a few pretty significant ones here. In the residential design standards, there are the new requirements for building setbacks and stepbacks. This is really a neighborhood compatibility ordinance dealing with residential scale infill. This is not in our current code. So as taller buildings are built in a neighborhood setting, they have to be set back further from the front side and rear property lines. The feedback we've been getting is that it's a pretty good balance that allows redevelopment and infill, but also provides for better compatibility with the neighbors. The other one I want to call out is in the multifamily section of Article 9. Feedback from the City Council was that maybe we should look at a few other things to help with housing affordability. So what we have here is a density increase for multifamily projects with small unit sizes. This does not change the setback or height standards or anything else. What we find in practice is the density limit is never a problem for higher end, more expensive projects. You know, if you have 4,000 square foot condos, you rarely, if ever, hit your density cap before you hit your site and setback cap. But on smaller, more affordable projects, they typically cannot build to their height and setbacks because they hit that density cap first. So this was a targeted way to help with housing affordability without changing the overall bulk and scale of development allowed on any property. This has been well received. Some feedback is that maybe it should be a little stronger. We should evaluate additional measures in the future. And then the third one I want to point out is in Article 11 related to non-residential. You've been grappling with the interface between industrial and residential for some time. It's a challenging land use pattern, but it exists in our community. This section requires additional provisions for compatibility when industrial developments proposed near residential. It has things like loading dock orientation. It has expanded landscaping for larger buildings, and it has a site-specific compatibility assessment required for larger projects next to residential. These projects will still require discretionary review, but it puts in code many of the issues that the Planning Commission and Council have been dealing with case by case as these projects have come through. Those are really the highlights of these articles. The new lighting code has been very well received. There were some refinements. We haven't received any concerns about that to date. We have a genuine lighting ordinance now as opposed to a paragraph in our current code. The technical working group did recommend some reduction in the allowed height of parking lot lighting. They felt that 30 feet was too tall and not necessary in mixed use and residential areas, so those heights have been reduced in this draft. Residential adjacency is a biggie. This is another area where it's a somewhat streamlined review, not as streamlined as many are recommending, more streamlined than others want, where we go to a site plan review as opposed to the full special use permit, but it applies to a broader area. That review would be required for property within 150 feet of residential as opposed to just adjacent, kind of dealing with the just next door but still impactful issue. There's a very targeted exemption for smaller projects under 10 acres across arterials and freeways. We did receive recommendations that should exempt any project. Others think it went too far. And then we have significantly enhanced standards for compatibility. Those also have been quite well received. You heard in the recordings at the beginning of this meeting Really, the comments we're getting on that involve the codified work hours for construction. Right now, we don't have any codes limiting hours of construction, so this is a new regulation entirely. You've been conditioning this in different ways on different projects. The ordinance is generally based on conditions of approval, and some of the recommendations you heard tonight were to make it stricter in the allowed hours of construction. But I know the contractors and the people who build things also feel very much the other way, that long work hours with our short season is often necessary. This document tried to balance those interests, focus on exterior work, allow a little longer hours for interior work, and have a more comprehensive way of addressing it with, again, exterior construction different than interior, and a special plan being able to be allowed for pouring of concrete that really can't occur during the day, and things of that nature. So that's a good discussion topic. Housing is more of an organizational change, and I hope that fairly brief summary was helpful. Open it up to discussion or questions. I'm going to click to the next slide so those viewing at home know where to reach us while we're having this discussion. And anyone watching, please contact us. We are getting towards the end, but it's not too late to get us your feedback.
Okay, thank you, Arlo.
Maybe what we could do, if I could make a suggestion, I'd like to spend time on the sustainability ordinance. I know this group's going to want to discuss it. Should we do everything else first and then return to that? I could actually flip through the line items. We received quite a few different letters on that, on all sides of the issue. But you may want a little more detail on that ordinance.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Commissioner Gower for some direction on that, because he seems to be the leader in that area. Does that sound good to you, that approach?
That's fine with me. I understand that there's a lot of discussion, so I'd be curious to hear what it is and, yeah, have a separate conversation, if you're all right with that, Madam Chair.
Absolutely.
Well, why don't we try to get your comments on the rest of it, and then we'll return to sustainability.
Okay, Commissioner, that sounds like Arlo's asking for our input. Commissioner Belto?
Yes, thank you. Arlo, you spoke a little earlier. I didn't write the exact slide down, but you were talking about density, and that there's been an issue where when there were more units and they were, say, lower price, they would hit their density cap. Developers would hit their density cap too soon. Can you direct me towards that section and explain how you determined how to revise that section to allow for more density?
Sure. I can probably just bring that up for you pretty quickly here. It is in Chapter 1804, Article 9, our additional standards. Let me just minimize here so I can navigate. Additional standards for multifamily districts. It starts here, density bonuses in multifamily districts. Hopefully you can read this from where you're watching. So there's kind of a tiered scale based on the size of units, where if your average unit size is under 1,800 square feet, you get a 10% bonus. That increases to 20% when your unit size is below 1,400 square feet, and to 30% when your average unit size is less than 1,000 square feet. So the maximum bonus would be 30%. That would be for projects with average unit sizes below 1,000 square feet. And the last provision there clarifies how this interfaces with the existing density increases allowed for affordable housing projects, and the cumulative density bonus is capped at 30% in total.
So how did you reach the percentages, the density bonus of 30% for 1,000 square feet, and what other percentages were being considered?
I'm not going to pretend there's some magic to these numbers. It was kind of a balancing. We had a discussion with stakeholders, council, and then pulled this back to the technical working group. In general, 1,000 square foot units are pretty small and pretty affordable. So people thought, hey, give them a 50% increase or an 80% increase. This is a little aggressive than that. Others felt no increases. So it's something. It's not going to be huge, and not numeric, but it was generally based on how small the units are, and you could proportionally increase density for those smaller units, which tend to be affordable.
So if I'm looking at it like we're trying to increase affordable housing, it seems like we'd want to have very large density bonus in multifamily districts for smaller units. What are the downsides to, say, putting a 50% density increase or a 70% density increase?
Well, you're going to get some comments, I think, on that tonight. Affordable housing isn't always popular with everyone, and higher density isn't always popular. I guess the counter argument would be, other than the kind of exclusionary arguments, which we don't support at all, more units do tend to involve more residents. Maybe there's a greater occupancy per square foot with higher density units. So I think the concerns to keep it from being more aggressive were more like, hey, if we get too aggressive, it could increase traffic, increase congestion, kind of impact the character of an area. But many others, including our Economic Development Authority, have recommended we get more aggressive with this, and also with things like ADUs and upzoning. So this document reflects kind of a balancing. The other piece I'd add is through the process, we're scoped out to do rezoning and neighborhood scale evaluations. This overall package would address kind of intensification primarily by considering rezonings neighborhood by neighborhood rather than kind of sweeping changes. But this is one that would be generally applicable. So I guess that's a long way of saying kind of a balancing of interests and recommendations, and that there's nothing magic about this, and increasing or decreasing, I wouldn't say would be right or wrong. It would just be a different policy adjustment.
And have you gotten any indication or I guess before I get into that, is there any direction that is more consistent with the master plan? And in conjunction with that, have you gotten direction from council as to where they stand on this issue?
This concept was endorsed and recommended by the council during their final review of the last draft. So we got that feedback at the concept level. They've yet to review the specific numbers. The master plan generally supports a greater diversity of housing types, including affordability. So there's general support for finding opportunities for affordable housing products and for a more compact development pattern. But how that's accomplished, there's flexibility. That's not really detailed in the policy document.
Thank you, Arlo.
Hey, Arlo, on that topic, is the density bonus tied to, or is there a link to affordable housing specifically? So you would think that, less than 1,000 feet would possibly be more affordable, but there's a lot of places that are not. So I'm wondering if there is a tie to it.
There's an existing ordinance that has density bonuses for affordable, deed-restricted affordable housing projects. So that's already in code. It's not very well utilized, and the recommendation in the update is to relax the requirements to qualify for that a little bit, so those incentives are a little bit stronger. So there already is that section in code. It's in Article 15. This kind of supplements it because there's a lot of affordable housing, small a affordable, that's not deed restricted or subsidized by HUD, but it's still where more people can afford living. The vast majority of our affordable housing stock is not deed restricted affordable. And that's what this amendment promotes more of, kind of affordable market rate or attainable housing, or whatever the wording that's used is, kind of the non-deed restricted, non-subsidized form of housing.
So if an applicant comes in and is going to build, 900 square foot luxury condos someplace, and it's not affordable, would they be able to get the density bonus?
Yes, there's no affordability requirement on this.
Okay. What is the likelihood of that happening?
Well, knowing the housing market pretty well, these smaller units are pretty affordable. Even in, I guess the Montage or some of our downtown condos are some of the more expensive. And even then, you can still get a condo for $200,000, and that's very unheard of. Those are non-subsidized. So this would be an Arlington Tower, although these don't have density limits. But there aren't very many really expensive 900 square foot units out there. Some are more expensive than others. They're not, again, deed restricted, but they're generally much more affordable. And again, getting back to, a product with those small unit sizes today really would not be able to build to the same height as the same project with 3,000 square foot units, because they would hit their density cap before they hit the height and setback limits. So there's a strain in planning theory now that goes much further and basically feels that density limits are inappropriate and it should be more form-based development. This doesn't go that far, but it's a step in that direction.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, questions?
Madam Chair, I have a question for Arlo. I'll take that as a yes.
Yeah, sorry.
In Article 1, the WUI section, Arlo, we've kind of talked about this a little bit before, and I understand that we're, as a city, essentially deferring to state code. I looked at that section in NRS, and it's a little bit tough to navigate. Can you kind of talk me through the advantages and disadvantages of, just referencing versus having like a nice WUI code kind of built into our document here that essentially mirrors what's in the state code?
A couple thoughts on that. I personally am an advocate for stronger wildland interface fire safety standards. In particular, things like wood fencing and very thick vegetation in our urban interfaces are potentially problematic. Our fire department for several years now have been implementing the WUI, and that basically is codified here that we're doing it. So this doesn't create a new requirement. There is on the possible future amendment list further work on wildfire safety. Specifically to your question, this would automatically adjust as those WUI standards change over time and get refined. So essentially, we would use the statewide standard as it is amended from time to time, whereas adopting mirror provisions would require that we keep up with those amendments. And I guess the third alternative is that the city adopts supplemental or different requirements, which is kind of where that potential future project would point towards. So this is an important issue.
Yeah, I think it is an important issue, and I think there's opportunities to have a little bit more clarity in our code, as you mentioned, for fencing, for vegetation management. I think the state code deals a lot with, structural components and materials and building, sprinklers and that sort of thing. But I think we could probably go a step further to have a little bit more specificity in our code based on, especially site-specific. You know, I understand that there's general mapping that identifies high and extreme risk areas, but, you know, I think as a city, we know that there are certain areas that, you know, I'm thinking of areas in the North Valley on the backside of Peavine that are constantly burning. And, you know, we're pushing development into those areas. And in my opinion, I think we need a little bit more language in our code that clearly articulates what the expectations are for development in those areas. And we're seeing the consequences of that right now. So it's a real-time issue.
I had this discussion with our fire chief and our fire marshal about supplemental standards, and their request was to be involved in that process. They have some expertise and some nuance, and that's a big part of why it's recommended to be addressed as a distinct process where we could focus on that. This is also a topic where we could very easily drive up cost. I mean, wood fencing's the cheapest. That's the quick one there. So there's some cost benefit considerations as well. We could look into doing more now, but we are getting a little tight on time to do it with this process.
My concern is that we have some development proposals on the radar that are, you know, proposed in the WUI, and if we don't incorporate things like vegetation standards that have a no cost or even a reduced cost element to them, that we might be doing ourselves a disservice as a city if we don't implement something like that in the near term.
That might be if we could do something that's fairly targeted and not like a giant research project, we could probably wrap it into this process and then potentially supplement it with future efforts. Maybe it's like calls for vegetation management plans and things like that with the projects. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, and I'd be comfortable with that, you know, essentially looking at fuel loading as part of a project and, you know, taking a look at our landscaping requirements and maybe scaling those back a little bit in certain areas to reduce those fuel loads. And again, that would be a cost reduction, presumably. And obviously building placement and, you know, fencing and all of that, as you talk about, that's sort of some additional components. But that fuels piece, I think, is something that we can't tackle now.
Okay. I got that. And once we wrap up the discussion, I'll just want to circle back and confirm kind of the broader direction, but continue on. Any other questions or suggestions before moving to the next section?
Commissioner Marshall?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Arlo, on sections, this has to do with hillside density and hillside open space. So this is 1804, 405, and 406. Can those tables, the resultant density and open space requirements be affected by clustering? And if so, should we drop a footnote in these tables that basically says that the limitations that come through this table are not subject to, those are the limitations that you need to work with?
This was a comment submitted by Councilwoman Breckus, really dealing with clustering of development. There's kind of two different topics. This density calculates the overall density limitations and reductions, so this is how many units. There's a clustering ordinance whereby people can get a 15% density increase if they shrink their lot sizes and develop on a smaller footprint. In general, staff sees some benefits to that because the smaller lot sizes, they're not going to sell for as much money. But on a hillside development, a smaller lot really reduces grading pretty significantly. So there's, I understand the argument for that, but I think if we did that, we would see very little clustering of development on our hillside developments because there would be no financial reason to do that. And we could end up with the unintended consequence of larger lot sizes driving bigger grading with the hillside development ordinance. So in general, I lean away from recommending that for that reason, because there is a good environmental benefit that 15% bonus creates, but certainly that's a policy choice.
But doesn't it also have the effect of pushing more people up into, just like our last discussion about the WUI, that's where we're getting higher and higher into hillsides, and, isn't the balance, I guess the question is, that you raised really is, what's the primary driver? Should it be the density limitations that, are, and the open space requirements, or is it, more that we want smaller lot sizes as a benefit from clustering when we get, more in these outer fringes areas? So it's, one I think could make an easily argument based on, where most of the locations are for these types of developments are more on the fringes, and so we're driving more density, more people out to the fringes than we want. What's the trade-off? I think you're right that it's probably ultimately a policy call. I think there's probably good reasons behind the density calculations for hillside and open space. And it's an interesting question as to when we weigh those things, what should come out as does it really decrease grading if you have more of it in a smaller area, or over a larger space but fewer lots or fewer buildings that actually require the grading? So I think, I don't know, my inclination would be to recommend something that says if these are the hillside density calculations that we think are appropriate, that we should stick with those. And I take it from your answer that it doesn't really affect the open space requirements. It's just a greater density within the designated area.
Yeah, that's correct. It potentially drives 15% more housing units, or allows 15% more in these areas in exchange for smaller lot sizes and a smaller footprint and less grading. That's kind of the trade-off.
Thank you.
It's a long-standing ordinance as well. I know it's been in place for at least 20 years. And most of our hillside development is PUD as well, so that comes into play.
Arlo, can we talk about construction hours? I think that was part of this section. What are we proposing?
Give me a moment. I'm just going to pull it up because it's a little bit nuanced. I'm so happy to be able to navigate a code this way. For those of you who aren't in this day in and day out, we can't do this today. So I'm going to shrink my view here again so I can see. So this looks a lot like conditions of approval that have been required on various projects, but it's codified. This standard applies for projects within 300 feet of residential zoned property. There's also cross-references that while it's in this residential adjacency standard, it applies to residential and non-residential. This first section deals with outdoor construction grading and also the use of mechanized equipment, power tools and things like that. 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday and 8 to 6 on Saturday, no construction Sunday, except owner builder of single family homes. Now that single family home kind of gets to the non-professional who's doing a home improvement on weekends, and an allowance for those specific projects to happen on Sundays. One of the recommendations was to add holidays in here, which I think is a good idea and was probably an omission. The other kind of shorten the construction schedule, does have both financial impacts, and it also extends the timing of construction. So you'll have shorter shorter days, but a longer duration. There's B, talks to how long you have to clean up after the end. C deals with construction more broadly allowed within a fully enclosed structure, 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. if it's interior work. D deals with the pouring of concrete that often requires cooler temperatures in the evening, where
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I kept going. Go ahead.
Can you go back? I'm trying to look at, why until 7 p.m.? I think most of our stuff right now says 6 p.m.
Yeah, most, it's varied. We saw a whole bunch of different conditions of approval, and they were different. So some were 7, some were 6. Construction workers tend to work longer days. So that's what this would permit. There's, you know.
If they work until 7 o'clock, then they have an extra hour for cleanup on the
yes,
back.
but they can't do grading, or the saws and the backhoes and all that can't be going, but they can clean up. So yeah, the recommendations you heard this morning are for shorter hours. I know the builders would prefer not having that. They'd like longer, but it's another policy choice you have.
Okay. And did you say that you would be adding in the holiday, the exclusion of holidays?
I think that makes sense. Sundays and holidays, and if the commission wants to recommend a shorter work schedule, you know, again, it's a matter of trade-offs, not a right or wrong.
I guess I'm not super concerned with the 7 o'clock p.m., but I think if they have an hour, I would rather see it go to 6 o'clock and then they have that hour after that. And, you know, we do that a lot on the horizontal side of construction, but maybe it's just a recommendation or something for consideration. Maybe I just think it's going to be hard to differentiate between 7 and 8 p.m. what contractors are going to be doing and whether they're going to be loading trucks or getting their equipment out of there. I think they should just be out of there by 7 p.m.
Could I get a little clarity on what that recommendation is? Are you suggesting 7 a.m. to 6 p.m.?
I'm saying, yeah, 7 p.m. to 6 p.m., and then you can still have that hour for cleanup on the end.
Thank you.
Arlo, this is Jeff Borkart. With regards to the holidays, I know in the past we had some issues with administering what actual holidays were holidays. What's a state holiday? What's a federal holiday? Different agencies observe different holidays. Is National Hot Dog Day a holiday? So I think that that's sort of something that would need to be clarified if we look into that.
Yeah, and we do that nuanced language. I'd recommend official holidays in the state of Nevada, which take the federal holidays and add Nevada Day, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, did the city and the state follow the same holidays?
To my knowledge, we don't have designated holidays. We take holidays on the state holidays. So we can define what those are in the code. What we do is add holidays here and then add a definition at the end of what a holiday is. I think it's 13 or 14 days a year, Labor Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July.
Basic holidays is fine. I'm not saying, stop work on Hot Dog Day.
Not Hot Dog Day, exactly. But Nevada Day, it's very important. Do we work on Nevada Day?
I guess it depends on where your money's coming from. If it's out of Nevada, you can work. If it's in Nevada, you can't work.
Okay. Are there other discussion items before I'd like to bring it back to a recap?
Yes, Madam Chair, Commissioner Johnson. Just a couple of maybe observations. I guess when we're in the site and the building standards, I know we went through a lot at the beginning, and you touched on it with all of the setbacks, and I agree. I think we hammered through that originally. so I don't really have any comments on it. I haven't seen any others. I do have maybe an observation, and it's not necessarily something for the code, and I think, Arlo, you and I have talked about it. There are a lot of areas in the site and building design standards that are, I guess, either technical or specific to different design ideas or design intent, that seem pretty prescriptive. And then I know we've talked about how there's, alternatives to that at the approval of the administrator. I think is somewhat of the terminology that we have. I think if you scroll down to the building, I think it's like, obviously every architect's favorite, the articulation standards. I guess the only thing that I want to throw out there, and maybe this is it's as much a question, go up for the building design, you were right there.
Particularly, on the non-residential, I'm going to pull up.
It's either one. It's kind of the same on both of them. And the concern that I have is that there is some information that's included in here that allows for, do any number of these different things. And then there's, an alternative method or alternative designs or, language kind of throughout talking about, either alternative method, alternative designs, and at the approval of the administrator. And my comment on that is currently no disrespect intended to anybody in community development, but the city does not have a position that requires either an architect or a design review committee or any requirement that the arbiter of all of this have the level of background that may be being talked about. And so you and I have discussed that there's not a language that I can use in the code, but I just want it to be kind of put on the record that we're putting some requirements on the design community here to basically potentially have to prove enhanced design, at least from our educated background. But we have nobody on the city side currently or, in the planned future that would be, have the same level of design expertise or that background to do that. So I'm not proposing any changes to this. I appreciate that it's in there. I just want to kind of point out that we don't have, the city right now does not have a vehicle for an alternative review to be looked at by somebody who has, either somebody or some entity that has the design expertise on that. And you and I have talked about it, and I know exactly where you're coming from and where the city's position is on it. I just want to, once again state that I wouldn't change what's in here, but I think we've kind of created some challenges to, maybe design elements that don't necessarily fit the standard box. So that's kind of, not really a question, it's more of a statement because we're in discussion. So like I said, I appreciate where we've gotten to from where we are, but I think we had some comment last night on a project that had a really, architecturally designed facade that was not necessarily indicative of the entire project. And I think that that's something that maybe needs to be understood by community development and, the city council in terms of what our opportunities are. So, like I said, not really a question, more of a rant than a statement, but like I said, I think it's above that. The alternative design approaches for those, that's an exception that you're showing there that works out great. It's under the wall articulation where you have an alternative, number 9 there, where, there's a lot of architectural things that I can do and that anybody can do that don't fit neatly into those boxes. And the administrator that we, that the city currently has as the arbiter of this is not required to be an architect. And again, no offense to any of the administrators that are there, but I don't profess to be a planner to that degree that they have. So that's kind of where my statement is at.
Just like to very briefly, we tried to minimize that. We also like clear standards. It was really the architects who were leading the charge that we need a little bit of flexibility on some of these. So we worked through these in pretty good detail with the technical working group, kind of landed on that, tried to incorporate kind of findings or determinations or the end product in that language. But there is some flexibility on topics like this.
Right, and I appreciate that, and that's really where I'm coming from on this, is that you've given us, you've given the design community the flexibility, but I don't know that the city has set itself up for the ability to make, to fully vet that flexibility that you've given us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think this is one of many topics that we really should kind of see how it works over the next year or two, and if necessary, make refinements.
Agreed. Thank you.
So on that topic, probably a broader question is, there's a lot of places within here where we defer to the administrator. Mm-hmm. Can you define who the administrator actually is and what the checks and balances is in that role of being the administrator? And then my second part of that is, at maybe a follow-up meeting, it would be, or you can reach out to me, it would be really helpful if we had some examples of where the biggest changes are going to be, where the administrator is going to be making decisions, or instead of going to planning commission. I don't know if that's possible, but this is so abstract looking at it. I'm wondering if you can look at one of our past agendas and look at a couple of projects and say, well, this isn't going to be going to planning commission anymore. This would come to the administrator, and this is the decision process, if that's possible. I know we're kind of...
It is, and we actually have a slide on that when we get to our next meeting in Chapter 1808. To your first question, Angela is the acting administrator. The administrator is the director of the Community Development Department.
Okay.
We're all in acting positions now, so it would either be myself or Angela, depending where our permanent jobs land. The checks and balances are all administrative decisions, can be appealed to the hearings examiner, and then up to the city council. That would be retained. And then to your second question, there are pretty limited changes.
Let me make sure I understand this. All administrative decisions can be appealed?
They get appealed to, we have a hearings examiner, which is the same place site plan reviews are appealed currently. But if there's disagreement on a business license being granted or a building permit, those types of things, it's a hearings examiner is the initial review of that. But it's not to be clear, it's not a publicly noticed, the neighbors get a postcard, they can show up and complain type of process. It's more, did they meet the findings that are applicable? In terms of changes, they're pretty limited. Really, the administrative decisions under this document are really close to under the existing document. The differences are on provisions like this, where an alternative design may be allowed by the administrator. That's allowed in a few, kind of in conjunction with the more detailed design regulations. We have a little more flexibility there. And a couple targeted changes like residential adjacency across a freeway, reducing the trigger for multifamily units. We'll go through those with Chapter 1808 and kind of pull those together specifically at your next meeting.
Okay, and then I had one other question. Commissioners, if you have questions, just raise your hand or unmute. And the accessible parking standards. Where'd you go, Arlo?
I'm right here. I'm just taking notes so I don't forget your comments. I'm listening.
What changes with the accessible parking standards, and are they less requirements or more requirements? And if you could just go over that for me, please.
Well, there's two pieces to this. The building codes and the American with Disabilities Act already requires accessible spaces within, I believe it's 100 feet of building entrances. That's separate from our zoning requirements, and that's still required unchanged. What we did...
Just real quick, because I'm trying to answer somebody's question that, for the public.
I think I saw the question.
If it's just because it's not in this part of the code doesn't mean there's not a standard or something that we have to follow someplace else?
That's correct. The building code requirements apply regardless, even if we didn't say a thing in Title 18. However, Title 18 also has accessible parking requirements, and it basically gets to how many spaces for different size. Those are recalibrated. The existing code, it's based on how many required spaces. And with the reduction in required spaces, we recalibrated it to basically we recalibrated it to be based on the number of provided spaces, not required, and then increased the number to reflect the overall reduction in parking to try to balance out and basically keep accessible parking requirements unchanged by and large. That is one of the refinements on your Exhibit D. It might have been the same commenter who emailed into you, recommended that to the technical working group. So there is a, fairly modest but still significant change to the accessible parking formula that's on page 4 of Exhibit D. So 1 space for the first 10 regular spaces, 2 accessible spaces if you have 11 through 30, et cetera. So on balance, it generally keeps the number of accessible spaces pretty comparable to what we require today.
What about in the downtown area?
The 100-foot from the entryway governs it. And then it would be, that's one of the main reasons we didn't base it on required spaces, but based it on provided spaces. So the same proportions would have to be provided depending how big their parking area is. And sometimes you'll see on-street accessible spaces for projects with no parking at all, although that's pretty rare.
Okay. Commissioners, other questions?
After Commissioner Marshall, I'd like to ask a couple too.
Okay, Commissioner Marshall.
Okay, I'll go very quickly. Arlo 1804602, pedestrian bicycle connectivity. This raises an issue that we've seen a couple times recently. Can we put something in here that says if you're providing a secondary fire access, that you cannot block bike and ped?
We could. You're going to stir up a few neighbors, but we could.
Or there's a default that says, all access. I think if we're trying to implement our city policies, that's a big one.
So this has, requires certain connections, but does not strictly require that every emergency access, connection has pedestrian connection. I think you had a big debate on that one up on near Sky Vista, if I recall. And their workout between the neighbors was not to have that connection. Your suggestion would make it mandatory.
Yeah, I think in terms of, to be blunt, there's a big neighbor storm can cause a political storm or a political influence. And if we really want bike ped, it might give, dare I say it, the city council a little more, of a backstop to say, hey, listen, that's in code. We think wherever there's an access route, it should promote bicycle. Be bold. Thank you.
Well, once I get all this out, I want to bring it back to what the body's going to recommend. Are there other things folks want to put on the table here?
Arlo, I was going to ask a question in terms of how the city would implement this connectivity section if you were posed with a project.
We'd, just like any other section of code, you know, we'd go through it line by line and make sure this section generally applies to subdivisions, and, you know, so we'd review it with the subdivision, we'd confirm it with the building permit, you know, just like we do sidewalk, landscaping, building design, any other requirement. I'm not seeing anything that's kind of uniquely challenging about this, kind of like our trip reduction ordinance does get a little challenging, but perhaps I'm missing that.
Well, I think it's kind of getting to what Commissioner Marshall was asking, is there's the connectivity on a planning scale, and then there's the connectivity on the actual physical or site scale. And I guess that was my concern, and thinking about that project and just thinking about others in the past where we've looked at connectivity, and there can be little minor barriers to connectivity, and does this code not only take those into account, but does it direct the city in a way to be on the lookout for those barriers? And it's like I said, it kind of points to what Commissioner Marshall is asking, but more than just there's a trail that leads to another trail and that sort of thing, but that those trails are free of physical barriers and that sort of thing. And how do we ensure that, going forward?
Well, this was hashed through in some detail at the technical working group. There was kind of a balance of some flexibility for design in terms of exactly where these connections are provided, but also a desire to list, what features need to be connected. We need a pedestrian walkway to parking areas, to the sidewalk, to the primary building entrances, for example, Commissioner Marshall's suggestion would be under F, where the current code requires connection to an adjacent residential development, but it doesn't tell them where they need to provide that connection. So there's a little flexibility, similar with the park and trail. They have to connect, but it doesn't detail exactly where.
Yeah, and I guess that was kind of the second part of it too, is, we've seen projects where they're put forward and they've implemented connectivity, and, I think it's great. But it's like, there's this pedestrian path that's all the way over here, so you have to, go outside of the subdivision and sort of come around, when in the case that I'm thinking of, there was a school that was literally, abutting the back fence of the development, but it would have taken, a quarter mile to walk around to the fence, to the school.
In that instance, we have our site and building standards also have connectivity. That would be prohibited by Articles 9, 10, and 11. There is some judgment call here. I highlighted the direct access. So we would kind of have to make a determination, is it reasonably direct as opposed to a big, long, circuitous route. And then it also has the design standards, which call for like breaks and fencing for connections. So there's some overlap with those site and building designs too.
And Arlo and the whole staff, I just want to say that I'm so happy that this section is in here. This was a big ticket item for me when we went through the master plan amendment to address connectivity. So I think it's just fantastic that it's in here and that there is, general agreement from all who have reviewed it that it's a positive element of the code.
This also, we have quite a bit of detail on what the walkway design has to look like, reasonably direct, lighting, all that type of stuff. Another topic where let's see how it works. These are new requirements. Hopefully they result in quality design and aren't unduly burdensome.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to ask about Article 8 landscaping, if no one else has any other questions on that.
Commissioner Gower?
A follow-up question on the accessibility. I don't understand, and I may have missed it, what, Commissioner Marshall, what your request is that's not in here? What is,
That was going to be my question, if to Arlo, so maybe I can clarify that. You know, first of all, it's a pedestrian access that says any adjacent, you have to connect to any adjacent residential neighborhood, planned or existing, F. So would that preclude the type of fencing we saw in that Sky Vista? It's not Sky Vista, the one up by off 4th Street.
The Sky Mountain project. You guys remember it was a multifamily project that connected
Yeah.
to another multifamily project, but that other project did not want this development to have access to their trail system.
Those people. So would that prevent that from, you know, to say that that's an adjacent neighborhood, and so you have to have some sort of connectivity, particularly when you have a road going right there?
It would, it gets into a judgment call for the administrator of, was that proposed connection direct, reasonably direct? And I think we repeat the a reasonably direct connections. I can't recall the exact details. I think it was slightly less direct than what would have been required by your proposal. I think we'd have to look at it site by site, you know, how indirect is it? So I think what Commissioner Marshall is suggesting is potentially more specific language, kind of defining that at vehicular access connections, including emergency connections, that be a mandated trail connection as well.
I would just put it the other way, that if there's an emergency access to another neighborhood, they can't block ped and bike access. Not saying that you have to plan, you know, I mean, but it just can't be you know, it can't be you can't ban bikes and peds from, or erect fencing to keep people out.
Got it.
Does that, Madam Chair, does that help a little bit, or is that's what I was trying to get at? That's just, you know, we saw one the other night about, you know, last night about, but staff put in a condition saying that bike and ped were to be allowed on that that emergency access road. No cars, but bike and ped allowed. So it would almost be implementing that kind of condition.
Marshall, I think that's particularly important for infill projects too. We saw that at Ranchera, where there was a concern about connectivity to adjacent residential areas, and there was a little bit of pushback from the project.
I'm also pulling up some relevant language that's related to this in Article 10 that speaks to barriers that hinder access. I can't quite see my language here. Providing access points, but the language in the code now is not as specific as what's being suggested here. So nothing, I'm not arguing against it, just that's my take. Any other items before we maybe do a recap on the appetite of the commission?
Commissioner Gower?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Arlo, I have a quick question on Article 8 for the landscaping, Section 805 there, 805, the standards. So great standards. What do we, as a city, have to ensure that those are implemented? And this may sort of bleed over into sustainability and ensuring, you know, enhanced tree canopy. I guess maybe two answers to that.
certainly we are responsible, our team, for verifying conformance before issuing any permits. So that would need to occur just as it needs to occur now. There's also kind of an ongoing process involving a tree protection ordinance that is separate from this update, but it's focusing more on the enforcement, administration, and kind of ongoing, you know, if you have a tree that was required when you built the project, are you maintaining it properly, irrigating and pruning it properly? And if you just come down and chop it down in the dark of night, probably beefing up the fines a little. So that's kind of outside Title 18. I think at this point it's going to come through subsequent to this code update, but it would supplement these development standards with changes to the enforcement regime.
Yeah, I guess there's, you know, the other approach is that you essentially, to ensure that the trees reach a certain level of maturity, that you implement some sort of security on the front end so you don't put the burden on code enforcement to make sure that they reach that maturity. And I know that you and John are familiar with that approach from working at the lake. That's a pretty standard practice up there.
Yeah, that's one of the topics kind of being reviewed through the tree protection. I know there's concerns about the financial impact and what's the right amount of security or the right approach or the balance between bonding and enforcement. That's all going to be addressed in that tree protection ordinance one way or another that's going to come back in front of you before too long here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
But Arlo, I have a question about boundary surveys. Is this the place where I would ask it?
No, the best story recommendation. We have a memo prepared. We're going to bring forward to the technical working group at their next meeting, and for you to look at with the procedures chapter, which is where that would live. There's different ways of addressing it. There's, you know, we don't hear the complaint a lot, but we've heard it very loudly from our commenter that she wants much more stringent boundary survey requirements. There is some nuance there and some significant financial impacts. You know, you could have a situation where your survey costs more than the fence you're building or the shed you're building or the small addition. Different communities handle it differently. So we had our consultants help with kind of a peer review of different options, and we're planning to bring that forward at your next meeting.
Fantastic. And I think we can move on. Don't see, let me see. Oh,
So what would be, are you guys all done?
I think so.
What would be really helpful to us is kind of to do a recap, and maybe someone could do a motion on kind of what's the appetite of the body. We got a number of suggestions from individuals. I think John Marshall's SPA was more of a question. We're gonna, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong one. Alex Belto had suggested to consider stronger density incentives. I don't know if that was a recommendation or not. Chair Taylor recommended reduced hours of construction to end at 6 p.m. and I think there was also support for including holidays. Commissioner Gower suggested supplemental language for the Wildfire WUI section involving requirements for a vegetation management plan, addressing fuel loading and potential modifications to landscape requirements in areas of presumably high and moderate hazard, if I have to guess. Commissioner Marshall suggested disallowing the density increases for cluster developments on hillside development projects. I think Commissioner Taylor's others were questions. Commissioner Marshall suggested a supplemental requirement on pedestrian connectivity to require connectivity at emergency access points between neighborhoods. Commissioner Gower, I might not have noted it down. I just have connectivity. I think you might have been supporting Commissioner Marshall's points or questions. So that's really what I have as the my list of potentially recommended changes. I'm hoping to get some confirmation that that generally reflects the desires of the body, or are there opposition to any of those adjustments?
I think I might have a concern on the density question about Alex. Was that increasing the density bonus up, I think you said up to 50%, or what was that specific request?
I don't know if there was a specific number tied to it, but I would like to encourage affordable housing as much as possible. So I think increasing the density bonus achieves that. If there wasn't really, if the 30% number was a compromise between various interests, I think we should err towards increasing access to housing and should have a higher density bonus at each of those levels.
We could, for example, increase each of those bonuses 50%, so they're 15, 30, and 45% bonuses. If that's the recommendation you have, some approach like that, I think is what I'm hearing.
Yes, that would summarize what I am recommending. Again, if that's the board's appetite, I think that's what I would prefer.
So Arlo, when you came to these numbers, was there a compromise between the TWG and some of the other folks at the 30%?
There was discussion. I think we got some comments just opposed to it wholesale, and others who suggested making it stronger. I think the adjustments we made were, the initial draft had smaller unit size requirements to get the bonuses. And we increased, so I think we had something like if it was under 600 or 700 square feet, you'd get 30%. And the recommendations made it a slightly more aggressive incentive in a pretty nuanced way. Again, it's another thing, there's not really a right or wrong, it's kind of how strongly.
I really support affordable housing. I just don't want, I would like to see something that ties the density bonus to affordable housing and not just increased density. And I don't know if that's possible. That would be my only concern.
Well, that's another option. We do have that in code, and it kind of maxes out, I think, at 30%. We could dive into the other section of code, I can pull it up here, that deals with the subsidized affordable housing and up those bonuses. A moment to find this. So this is already somewhat strengthened from our existing ordinance. It kind of has different levels of density bonus depending on what your level of affordability is. Those were changed so you could get the bonuses with slightly less affordable. We had very few properties who said this was a meaningful incentive, so we're trying to get some increased utilization. So those were the changes there. And the other change was the deed restriction today requires a 30-year deed restriction to qualify, and this reduces it to 20 years, again, to try to make it more of an incentive. The feedback we got from developers were that the requirements for this were so strict under our current code that it wasn't worth it. The bonus wasn't meaningful for them, so it wasn't an incentive.
So are you saying that we could increase the bonuses here if we wanted to tie it directly to affordable housing?
Mm-hmm. We could say, for example, do a 50% increase to the bonuses listed here or something like that. And this section deals only with the subsidized deed restricted affordable housing. Or you could do both.
I like it in this section, but Commissioner Velto, what are your thoughts?
I think we should do both. I appreciate that you're looking at ways to tie it to affordable housing. I think there might be some other situations where the result is maybe it's not tied to maybe that's the property itself is not affordable in terms of affordable housing, but I'm a firm believer in more supply equals prices go down. So I think either way you're going to get a good result, and I'd be in favor of doing both, having density bonuses that aren't tied to affordable housing, as well as your idea of having them tied to affordable housing.
One more thing for consideration, I would say, for every one unit that we have as subsidized affordable, which generally involve funds from the federal government, we probably have 9 units that are market rate but still generally affordable. So the other section will hit a lot more projects and provide incentives for more projects than this section will.
Other commissioners, do you have any comments? Commissioner Munoz?
Yeah, Commissioner Munoz for the record. Real quick, Arla, just a quick question. What was the feedback on the proposed changing of hours, or was there a proposed changing of hours from the 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. For the construction community, or was there any feedback on changing those, and also the holiday recommendations for taking those off?
We might have participants here who may want to comment. I think I saw a building association rep participating. We could ask. My guess is, and we heard initially, not with this specific review and discussion today, that drives up the cost of construction. Each additional day they have to mobilize and bring in the crew. That's why they like working 12-hour days and like getting projects in and done and out. It also affects the seasonability. Oftentimes construction projects are trying to wrap up before winter comes in. So there is an impact. I'm assuming the building community would oppose that change. They were generally comfortable with the hours that are outlined in the draft. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I doubt you'd have Dante throw up here saying, I support that reduction.
Madam Chair, I don't know, it's just as a way to maybe move us forward. I think Arlo, I appreciate your desire to get specific direction. I think a lot of these things, at least for me, kind of, I'd appreciate having, the rest of the, the rest of the discussion, and then maybe coming back and either, at some, maybe the next meeting, kind of hashing these things out. I can foresee that this might take us not an insubstantial amount of time trying to come to consensus or a vote on each item. I don't know if you might have a more efficient way of working through.
I have a thought. I mean, what I was really hoping to hear is, is there general consensus on this, or is it just John Marshall going crazy? Sorry, no offense. Is it an interest of the body rather than individual? I'm not hearing a lot of dissent on these changes, maybe some apprehension on a couple items. Given that, maybe what we could do is write these up as issues that Planning Commission wanted us to look into further and consider changes to. We could put together kind of some draft adjustments, run it through the technical working group. You could get their recommendations and bring it back at your next meeting. we do ultimately want to get the planning commission recommending something to the city council. But we could finalize at the next meeting and bring you back something with actual language.
I'd be in favor of that. I don't know what fellow commissioners think.
I can get behind everybody's request. I mean, I respect Commissioner Velto's recommendation to get more affordable housing. There's nothing that has been presented that I can't support. I mean, that's my position. I think we could get there from what I was hearing. I don't know.
And I would add, if you do kind of generally support when we bring it back in 3 weeks with specifics, you can always change your mind or suggest adjustments to what we write.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Johnson, I know we're getting closer to the end on this, but up until this point, every time this has come before us, it's really been as much of a discussion as anything else. We've taken, staff has taken all of our comments and kind of incorporated that through the mixer that is the council and the design working group and staff and everything else. We're obviously getting closer to that in the sense that there's really only a couple of items here that, commissioners have gone back and forth on. So I think the approach of, as Commissioner Marshall stated, these are the discussion items that we had. There was consensus on, X, Y, and Z, and there was additional discussion back and forth on these items, and the Planning Commission will, continue to review that by the time the final draft comes to us. Because honestly, correct me if I'm wrong, Arlo, ultimately it's our final recommendation to council that we're doing later this year that's based on an actual finalized draft. This is still a working draft that's getting close to adoption, but this recommendation that we give now is not the last time we're going to be seeing this and recommending it to council.
It's not, but that being said, at your next meeting, we really do want your recommendations to go to council, because the final hearing is going to be adoption, and it would be very unwieldy. I mean, you can recommend, hey, we oppose this section, we recommend this specific change, but ideally we can get, at least your big picture recommendations known at your next meeting.
And I think, and I appreciate that, Arlo, because I think that really the two items that I'm hearing that we may not have complete agreement on, a lot of it is because we're asking for a little bit more feedback from where the technical working group came from. I mean, I think both Commissioner Velto's question and Commissioner Taylor's question between the hours and the density bonus, both of those are kind of coming at us from some other recommendations, and it would be good to, sort of understand that a little better, and I think that's kind of where the questions are coming from. So I'm not trying to say we don't want to make a discussion. I just think that the items that we aren't finalized on yet, it's because we've asked for additional information from staff and the other entities reviewing this.
Yep. And that's great. That's why we have multiple meetings here. So we'll write these up as suggestions from the Planning Commission to explore as amendments. We'll get feedback from stakeholders in the technical working group, bring that information back at your next meeting. We are going to have, I know we've already gotten some additional public suggestions on these chapters, so we'll kind of have a little go-back discussion at your next meeting before we dive into the rest of the code. And we do have a little bit of time built in where if you wanted to have a third meeting to follow up on any outstanding items, we can fit that in. So we have a little room in the schedule to allow a third discussion meeting if you want.
So for clarification on the construction hours, I'm coming from a recommendation from public input on what the community wanted. I don't necessarily need any more information from the TWG. I understand their position fully. I'm just thinking that in the time that I've been here, I don't see us going to construction until 7 p.m. Usually we're at 5 or 6 p.m., so I think we're offering them another hour of construction, but I would also want the cleanup in that to work with the residents in the holiday hours. So I don't need any more, I don't know if anybody else does, but I don't need any more information. That was just a recommendation from you've received.
I think I got enough detail to understand where the commission's coming from, and we'll be able to write this up and bring it back. Should we move on to sustainability?
I can't wait.
We love zoning. That's what we do around here.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Johnson, can I make a request for a 5-minute break before we jump into sustainability?
Now, hey, I asked for a 5-minute break last night, and I got this.
Well, we didn't have an item of this size coming up on us.
Okay, guys, want to take a 10-minute break? Yes.
I would appreciate that.
We'll see you in 10 minutes.
So the meeting will
Thank you,
resume
Madam
at
Chair.
7:57.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, 7:57, get started, Arlo, let's go.
Wait, we need to make sure everybody's here.
I'm joking, sorry, Michelle.
I'm with you. I see Angela's down in council chambers.
I am. It's a little lonely down here. Just me and Michelle and Brian from IT.
We'll be there someday.
Thank you, Brian, thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome.
John, or Commissioner Marshall, are you with us, or should we just, are you just,
I'm with you.
okay. It is 7:58. Let's resume the presentation.
Just before I go into sustainability, I did want to, in our summary, we will bring back information Commissioner Belto requested on the animals and the legality of that next meeting as well. Does the commission want, I think there are at least a couple members of the public here. Should we take public comment before we go on to the next, or would you like to do that at the end?
You know what? I think it would be a good idea to do it now. I, to be completely honest, have not had people come in from the Zoom meeting before during public comment, so I will need some help guiding us through that. But let's see if they would like to participate now, and then maybe they don't want to sit through everything else. Michelle, is that doable?
Are we doing a 3-minute public comment?
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Are we doing 3-minute for public comment?
Yes, please.
We have Donna Keats on the line, and Melinda Smith. So Donna, if you would like to make a public comment, could you please raise your hand? Oh, it is. Okay. We're going to move them in then. Hang on just 1 second. Donna, are you there?
We see Donna, but she's muted. Can you unmute on your end, Donna? At the bottom left of your screen. Or *6 if you're on a phone.
May have stepped away. Maybe we can try.
Donna did submit some written comments reviewed prior to this. I think it's in the packet, the link that Michelle sent out if she's unable to connect.
Should we try Melinda then and wait for Donna to get back online?
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Melinda.
Hi, Melinda, we can.
Okay.
Great.
You have
so
3
this is
minutes.
Melinda Smith. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. You have 3 minutes for public comment. Okay.
Great. Thank you. I'm with the Builders Association of Northern Nevada. I did submit a letter earlier today on our thoughts on the overall zoning code and just wanted to give a few extra comments. As we did mention, we're part of the technical working group and have very much appreciated the opportunity to ask questions, provide input during each phase of the process. Staff has been so great in addressing ours as well as the other organizations' comments and suggestions. And overall, we're supportive of the direction of the new code. It's so much easier to follow and there are clearer processes in place. But we do have serious concerns with the sustainability section. We believe this will have a financial impact on residential housing. For every $1,000 that the price of a home increases, to 251 people in Northern Nevada are priced out of the market. If we're going to raise the price of a home, we'd like to see data on how the sustainability section will actually make an impact to air quality standards and the environment. Also, in my letter, we have concerns with penalizing projects that are located in the outer and foothill neighborhoods. There are certain kinds of developments that simply don't work in downtown or infill locations. And we do need housing near industrial centers for people that work there. Otherwise, they'll be forced to travel long distances, increasing VMTs. So in closing, we just ask that you take our concerns under some consideration, and thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you, Melinda. Michelle, were we able to get Donna in?
Let's try again. Donna?
Hi.
Hi, would you like to make public comment?
Yeah, I guess I lost track of time. I didn't know what you did. No, I want to thank you guys for hanging in there. And obviously, many of you read the information that I sent you, or at least summary read it. So I want to thank you for bringing those things up. Can you hear me? Is my mic on? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I thought a couple of things. I mean, it seems to me that changing anything in the code is not really going to happen because you've knocked out your details. But honestly, you have these things in here like the density bonuses that you say will increase affordability. It increases number of units. Why don't you do something about workforce housing at the 80 to 120% AMI? If you're going to give them something, get something back. If you look up the definition of density in the code, it actually says something the city gives in return for a blah, 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 which I wrote in the stuff that I sent you. And that's not happening here. You're just giving them density. I don't object to the densification and the thing about bringing, that's not what I'm about. I mean, but you have all these competing interests, single-family property rights. They're talking about MS-14 with all these setbacks and what's going to happen there in the Old Southwest. I mean, this is not confusing. And it's not just the front setback either. Although the MS-21 and 30 are also being set back, not just MS-14. And it's got, there's a lot of stuff like that that's it's in the details. And the generalities, you try to look at these areas that you want to redevelop. I'm asking that some of the little details get looked at, because in a new area, I don't care. Give them 20 units without having to get a discretionary permit. But in SF4, in MS-14 in Old Southwest, give them 20 units there without a discretionary permit. That's absurd. And it's really just huge disenfranchisement of everybody over there who still believes they live in a single-family neighborhood, which is not me, as you know. But it's just wrong, and they don't know what's going on. You know, you're not sending letters that say we're changing your zoning, because you're not changing their zoning. You're just changing everything about what happens in their zone. So they don't know, and I just really think this is an unfair process that's happened in this way. Public is not involved. It's all about how we can densify development and enable current planning practices, which are happening all over America and every city I've visited. I get that. That's not actually what I'm saying. I'm saying the people who built this city deserve to know what's going on, and they don't. So you're going to reduce the setback to site. You can take multifamily, make it look like single family. You're going to let them have no discretionary permits up to from 4, where it is now, where something changes at 4, everybody knows that. But now you want to go like a 20 units. And you're talking about those areas of town is where they want to do it. And if anybody's driven around Old Southwest anytime lately, or behind Ace Hardware or off the streets of Virginia, look at what they're doing with that. They're doing $450,000 townhomes. They're not doing affordable housing. So the reality is number of units is number of units. You can make number of units. And to add to that, you're excluding half-width penthouses as counting against building height. I mean, there are so many little pieces to put together to see what's really happening, and you're not getting that picture. And I think that's unfair. So is that the buzzer that just went off? I don't know. Yes, anyway, do you understand what I'm saying?
I think that's the buzzer. Thank you, Donna.
That's what I was asking. I couldn't hear it. I couldn't tell. Okay, thank you. I appreciate your.
We have Leah Sanders there. I don't know. Leah, if you can hear me, do you want to make public comment? If so, raise your hand. She's not raising her. No, she didn't raise her hand, so I don't know if she wants to make public comment.
Okay.
Those are the
Well, we'll close public comment for now, and then we'll have another opportunity at the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right. Well, I think we're ready for the sustainability ordinance here. So this has been a big topic of recent input. As a little background, you probably remember during the round of review of the prior draft, this was a significant discussion topic. Some were advocating for some additional standards related to requiring solar-enabled or pre-wired or set up for solar panels on all homes, as well as electrical vehicle charging. Garages, there were some concerns that you heard still from the Builders Association about affordability. We did some research, conferred with our consultants, and they recommended, kind of as a balancing of interest, that we look at the city of Henderson and the sustainability ordinance they've had for some time. So we did that. This is certainly a topic where, it's a policy choice. You're going to hear proponents of a stricter ordinance, and you're going to hear proponents of a less strict ordinance. Generally, the interface of the environment and the economy is right where we're at right now. So this package that's been in place in Henderson and has been amended at least once, I think it's been in for about a decade, essentially provides a menu of options and a minimum point requirement. I can back up. So different affordable housing, this first section is there's some relaxation and exemptions for affordable housing provisions. This was an adjustment we added to address some of our housing challenges and the potential for cost to increase with these new requirements. It looks like the applicability isn't in this print, but basically different types of projects have a different point total that they need to reach, and the ordinance provides a significant list of different options to get there. So it does require sustainability features. Our assessment is this has additional requirements not currently required, so it is meaningful. It's not a nothing ordinance. But at the same time, it provides flexibility for what types of provisions can be provided with projects to reflect, different locations or design considerations. So you'll see a series of red lines here. We presented this, publicly and to the technical working group, got a lot of recommendations. We had a side breakout meeting with a number of the stakeholders. On flies, I can't even remember when that was. I think it was last week. And made a series of refinements. These refinements, they might make it a little more strict, but in general, they kind of balance out, and I'd like to go through each of these. And a lot of this gets a little bit nuanced, and I know this commission has a lot of interest in the topic. We got a number of letters, even very recently. The regulatory agencies are really advocating. I think they're comfortable with this point-based ordinance, but they want more points required or to tighten it up a little bit. And pretty much a number in the development community felt it was too much and the financial impacts were going to be impactful and cause additional barriers to housing. The technical working group did not make a specific recommendation. They acknowledged this is really a policy choice, but they did suggest a number of these refinements, which are fairly nuanced. So the first of the refinements involve renewable energy generation. The suggestions were that, points were too easily given for a small amount of renewable energy production. So this amendment cuts that benefit in half from 2 points for each percent to 1 point for each percent, but it also increases the total points available. So a 40% solar energy project would get 40 points, which gets them most of the way to this requirement. So if you kind of think about what's required, what does this mean? If you do 40% of your energy generation with solar or wind, you're pretty close to there, and you may be there on different areas. Then there's a series of district heating and cooling, orientation, generally with much smaller point totals, little things that save energy and reduce emissions, shade structures, heat island reduction. These are all from the Henderson Ordinance. Shaded walkways. Oh, we did tweak the window shading measurement in the draft. I think there was general support for that tweak. Added some language here on solar-ready design to include that the buildings have to have the structural capacity to add panels. This change was called out, I think, in David Bobzine's letter from the State of Nevada Energy, I'm not using the right term, but that group. This essentially converts the bonuses for energy efficiency to get points if you're a percentage greater, 10% greater than the minimum requirement, as opposed to having specific numeric standards. So this would change as new energy codes are adopted. You'd still need a 10% greater to get the point total. That was an amendment based on our discussion. There were suggestions that projects that use fully electric construction and don't require gas would be beneficial and some points should be granted. That was added. I think the intent of this is more for the future when our electricity grid portfolio goes more and more renewable. A little point addition there. There's a whole flood resiliency, use mix. This is all Henderson language. Compact development and walkability, reduced footprint. Now, two that we added in our initial draft, we added this urban infill location as a modification from the Henderson Ordinance to provide some differentiation between projects in a walkable setting like downtown getting 10 points and those in a mixed-use urban setting getting 5 points as opposed to outline development. Some of the recommendations were to deduct points for outline development. So the suburban location is a -5 point total. That would apply if you're in an outer neighborhood or a foothill neighborhood as depicted in the master plan. You'll note, those of you who reviewed the comment letters, that these address just about all of the topics raised. I think it's fair to say that the health department would probably increase the point total a little bit and up the requirement, and I think the state regulatory agencies support that. Again, this is kind of a balancing here. The next amendment, I'll be pretty quick here, but I think it probably warrants. This section here adds points available for electric vehicle ready construction. Greater number of points, up to 5 if you have charging stations, and 2 points if you have basically run the conduit and have the panel size but don't have a full station. And there's different sections for single family versus other projects. I'm not sure if we have other adjustments. On balance, you know, staff acknowledges the legitimacy of the interests on both sides of this topic. We are reasonably comfortable with this being meaningful but not unduly impactful. We felt it was important to add some of those adjustments for more affordable and smaller unit sizes because those are really the more affordable products, whereas a 4,000 square foot house is not affordable and can probably afford to, add $1,000 or two to construction. So we tried to refine it. We're pretty comfortable with it on balance, but again, this is really a policy decision that we have in front of you. I think that wraps up what I wanted to say. Happy to answer any questions or take your feedback.
Great, thank you, Arlo. Commissioners? Commissioner Gower, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's great. I think it touches on a lot of the topics that we talked about through the master plan update. It captures a few additional items that aren't covered elsewhere in the code, and I think it covers some key topics like urban heat island, shade trees, electric vehicle charging, that we've talked about on a project-by-project basis, and it finds a way to codify them. So I'm really pleased with how it looks. You know, I recognize the affordability concerns, and you know, I think there is, to Melinda's question, I think there is ample data to support a low or negligible, or a lot of times if you look at it more holistically, on the cost benefit side, a positive impact on costs. So I'm supportive in that sense. And in terms of the air quality, I think there's ample data to support how the sustainability ordinance like this will promote not only improved ozone for ozone advance, but other air quality indicators. So I'm in favor of it. Thank you.
Great. Other commissioners?
Madam Chair, this is Commissioner Velto. I have a couple of questions for you, Arlo. How did the so I'm all for sustainability. I'm just, as with, you know, some people concerned with about pushing the cost to the buyers and to the tenants. When I do like a point system, because it seems to give developers options as to what fits their project and try to optimize both costs as well as protecting the environment. What does a point mean in this metric? Is it tied to X amount of CO2 or ozone, or is it kind of an arbitrary signifier of something good for the environment?
I'd say a little of each. I don't think there's an exact, you know, numeric calculation of a point equals, you know, X environmental impact. This ordinance addresses a range of topics, so whether it's ozone, you know, other changes focus, or other points, you know, are for water conservation or urban heat islands. So it addresses a range of environmental considerations. We kind of liked it because it was time-tested and refined. And, you know, the reports we got that, you know, while it can be a little cumbersome, it's going to add some complexity to the permitting process and the review process, that it had been tried, it had been refined, and it was, it endured. It didn't get repealed. It was, you know, reasonably doable, but still meaningful. So I guess that's a long way of saying it's somewhere between scientific and arbitrary. Certainly not arbitrary, but not, you know, a numeric calculation either.
Okay, and do you know if there was a comparison of cost for implementing each, like various point values? Like if you look at, you understand what I'm asking, if there's like, you know, one of those, let's say something is 2 points, is there an estimate of what the cost would be for each of those? And are there various point allocations which are less costly to builders versus others?
I don't think we have the level of detail of kind of scientific documentation that Melinda was asking for. We can work to quantify that, but I'm not sure that's quite available. And it's going to differ. It's also hard to quantify because some of these features are, real easy for certain types of projects and real difficult for others. If you just think about a solar panel, what's the environmental benefit of a solar panel? It really depends on the orientation and the solar exposure and tree canopy and all that. So it's really difficult to quantify with specificity. I'm sure Commissioner Marshall up at TRPA could produce an environmental document this thick. We're a little tight on resources to get that deep, but we could try to, pull together some additional info on that. Our take is, well under 1% cost impact and much less with the affordable products, basically none. We made the point total pretty low on affordable housing. So we don't expect really a significant impact at all on more affordable housing product, but it will increase the cost of larger homes and also non-residential development to some degree. A lot of the architects and other designers on the committee, some of them thought that they were doing it already, and this would kind of give credit for it, of kind of current, design practices, but others felt that it really would generate pretty big changes. So I'm not really giving a specific answer, but I hope that helps.
It does help, and I appreciate that feedback and insight. As far as the affordable housing exemption, is that the same type of affordable housing we were discussing in the previous section that is more difficult to build, or is there a certain price point that you use as a cutoff to where no longer does this metric apply?
We have both, and the screen share I had before had that section cut off. I can share my other one. There's two different pieces that have adjustments related to affordability. One is on the size and one is on the subsidized affordable housing. So let me bear with me for a sec while I find this. So we have purpose, we have the general requirements. This is the section that goes through the point totals, non-residential at 42. There's some lesser points allowed for adaptive reuse and improvements, but generally it's 42 points with somewhat less for improvements. Where do we have? The trigger is 35% addition, so adaptive reuse projects that don't increase floor area are exempted. Here's the first of those exemptions. Buildings under 1,500 square foot in size are generally exempt. Similarly, like utility projects and things of that nature that don't lend themselves are exempted. That it was in the Henderson Code as well. So that's kind of the first piece. Very small buildings are exempted. And then for the subsidized affordable housing and also unit sizes, there's kind of a percentage reduction. Under 1,200 feet reduces your points by 25%. Subsidized reduces points by 75, 50, or 25%. So those subsidized affordable units, they're pretty much going to be able to meet the requirement without significant change to their design. Small units, 25%, maybe they'll have to do a little something, but it's all the other projects where it's more significant.
And do you see that percentage breakdown at all providing an incentive to build affordable housing?
Little bit. I mean, it doesn't hurt. I don't think it's going to be a make or break for anyone, but I think it keeps this from being an impediment to affordable housing at a minimum, and possibly an incentive to some degree.
And how did you reach those percentages? Is there, I guess, a method to that, or is this similar to the bonus density percentages?
Yeah, there's a more art than science, kind of bigger reductions for more affordable. and lesser reductions for less affordable. And I'd add, this is certainly a topic, assuming something like this gets adopted, that we should really monitor closely and see how it works and what sort of design changes it drives. And I'm sure we'll get information on what sort of cost impacts it drives. I definitely recommend we assess this 6 and 12 months out to see how it's going.
Okay, thank you, Arlo.
Madam Chair, may I?
Oh, yes, please. Here you are. You're down at the bottom.
Arlo, you know, I like my previous comments. I compliment you on getting this system up, and yes, it's not quite as complex as the scenic system at the lake, but it's one that I think can drive positive change. I think it would be useful for me and also probably for the public if we could get some examples, and maybe from Henderson of here's how it worked down there. Here's the projects that were built with it, and here's kind of their experience with this kind of system. I'd like to kind of supplement Commissioner Gower's comment, particularly about how we look at cost, and that I would encourage a broader examination of cost to include not just purchase price, but a greater examination of if you have systems that are reducing energy costs, that are reducing other kind of potentially health benefits to society, that might inure to the occupant, that those be that it's just not a simple it's going to add X amount to the price of the house. I think it is a larger context in which we're making these changes. A lot of it is, it's a stretch, but you look at global warming, you look at what's happening in the West now, look at our current air quality. It's an interrelated system that we need to do things like this in order to avoid, making these consequences perhaps worse. So I think I'd like to advocate for some examples that could help people get a better feel for what the numbers mean, and how is it implemented. It may not be exactly these numbers, but if Henderson has a similar system, people can see, okay, I see how they got to the minimum number that they needed. So that's it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
We'll try to pull together some of that info.
So Arlo, some of Melinda's comments, are there specific items within this section that there were concerns with?
I think it's just the overall. Melinda can pop in if she wants, but kind of no matter how you get there, it's probably going to add some increment to the cost to develop the housing. Commissioner Marshall makes a good point. Certainly there's reduced costs for heating or whatever if you have solar panels. I did my panels, and it's going to be a almost 30-year payoff period, but our electric bills are less. So, and there's also obviously the environmental impacts. We really did try to focus on the affordability impacts with these reductions and other adjustments for affordable housing products. Henderson didn't have that. It's pretty much the same for anything regardless down there. And they also didn't have the locational considerations where we added in, you know, point adjustments for outlying areas and points being added for infill areas. So those were kind of those concerns were the focus of the changes made to the Henderson ordinance. But it's overall, I mean, I think Melinda would probably say, hey, maybe cut these point totals by some. It's just the overall impact, as I understand.
It seems like it strikes, looking at it, a balance between affordable housing and sustainability and having them work together. And you mentioned that you're going to be watching this. What is the process for that? How are you going to track it to see if things need to be changed?
Just like Commissioner Marshall suggested we do now, I think we should, you know, show examples of projects that come through under this ordinance and what they look like, what they've done, how they've addressed it. You know, with any luck, we can get some folks to share with us what the cost differential was of doing this. That type of information, kind of look at it, real world examples. Other things, some of the adjustments here were also climatic adjustments to reflect differences between northern and southern Nevada, where they don't really have heating as a major consumption of energy. It's cooling.
Other commissioners? Commissioner Gower?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just, if I could respond to some of the questions and comments about the cost and the point system and the trade-off between sustainability and economics. I mean, that's a classic question, right, with all of this. And I just want to point out two things. So number one, I think one of the neat strategies about this menu, and including with the additions that have been added for the location of the development, it really addresses the transportation piece. So it's not just about the energy consumption at the building. It's not just about the heat island. It looks at not only the energy that's consumed by automobiles, but all of the greenhouse gas emission impacts from autos that contribute to climate change and contribute to our ozone problem. And I think this directly addresses that. I think the benefit of that is that it promotes a development pattern that we talked about through the master plan that promotes walkability and all of the benefits that come with that type of development pattern that on the health side of things that we don't need to get into, but there's so many positive health and economic benefits to that. I did want to point out, Commissioner Velto, to your point, or to your question, I'm looking at the menu here on my screen too. If a development were to take credit, location credit alone, so not implementing any of the things like EV charging or solar ready or anything like that, just taking the credits for the location of the development, so essentially infill, if it had walkability components, interconnectivity, some of those proximity to transit, you could, in theory, get 46 points just on the location of the project alone. So there's no cost implications with that. You're not adding anything to the upfront cost of the building. It's strictly by the location. And the benefits of that from the cost side are that your overall costs, your living costs are lower because you're not commuting from the North Valleys or South Reno to the North Valleys or back and forth in your automobile. You have that walkable environment, and it reduces your overall living costs. So it's a win-win in that scenario. You're reducing the life cycle costs, the things that John Marshall was talking about for climate. So I mean, that's all the positive economics that are built into something like this. And I'm happy to share data that would support that statement, but just wanted to point that out with the scoring too. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Johnson, if I can follow up on Commissioner Gower's, I was going to bring up the exact same point. This is not too far removed from what we would have to do to get like a lead project, the USGBC, which I've been involved in several of those. And I agree completely with Commissioner Gower. There's, you get a ton of benefit from putting the building in the right spot. Some of the things that you also get are just in the inherent, there's a lot of passive design things that we're trying to encourage anyway, that also add to the point total. So I think it's very easy to look at what the added cost would be to make a site completely EV ready, or to think that we're being punitive by looking at what's outside the main urban core. But I do think the approach that the city's taking here is the right way to go. That said, I do have a couple of concerns, and to use Arlo's term of nuanced, I'll get a little bit geeky on this, but there's a number of things in here, some of the more technical things and some of the areas that are looking at products and looking at mechanical systems and things like that, that are included in the design, but I'm not sure there's a way to verify that. And one of the issues from a standpoint of trying to get a building certified through LEED, we found that the biggest expense to the project is the time spent documenting compliance with all of these items. And so I guess the question that I have back to the city is, has there been some discussion, and it's really going to be the building department's responsibility to compare when the building plans say that this is the product that we're using with this amount of recycled material, or this is the mechanical system that we've called that's 20% more efficient, the ability to actually follow up on that. Because usually you sign off on a building permit for life safety issues, and the inspectors aren't the ones that are verifying that all of that's in place. So that's just it's a comment as much as anything else that I would like the city to look at that. There's also a few things in there with respect to, say, daylighting, where it talks about implementing daylighting strategies. That needs to be better defined. I know with LEED, they look at percentage of building that actually receives daylighting. It's not just an implementation of saying you're going to be doing daylighting. So I do think there's a number of kind of technical things that I think maybe circling back, as Commissioner Marshall pointed out, with examples in Henderson, to see how are they able to track some of this, because I think it's a great system. I think, the idea of being able to select, a menu of things that you're going to do as a designer is great. But I do think there's some concern, at least on my end, when I read this, as to how it's actually going to be tracked to make sure that what we're asking for, especially on some of these more technical things, are actually being tracked. So you get more of a comment and less of a question in there for you, Arlo, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, it was on point. We've had a lot of those discussions. My understanding, some of the refinements Henderson did was to address the administration of this. They previously had a number of things that were difficult to measure accurately. There might still be a little of that in here. I guess a few questions or comments or whatever they were in there. In general, when we went through this, we think it's all pretty measurable, and we would, have to review it at the building permit stage. I will say this is going to increase administrative costs and also design costs on applicants to demonstrate conformance with this, but they're pretty much all measurable. We'll take another look at the daylighting. So I think we can do it, and it's also something we'd have to include in the inspections. So it makes the permitting process, some increment more cumbersome. that may end up being a greater cost impact than the actual design changes. But we feel pretty comfortable that it's measurable enough that we can have our checklist and say, yes, 2 points, yes, 3 points, and, measure is it 10% or 20% and that they comply or not. But there are going to be some administrative challenges, and I want to keep an eye on that as we move through the implementation phase.
And I appreciate that, Arlo. That was just the one thing that I was looking at. The other thing, I do want to compliment the change on the energy efficiency, that note that was there, because one of the first things I had before I saw the changes were that it seemed like we were actually giving people points for meeting code, which didn't seem to be what the intent was. So I think this is a good change, and it's in keeping with what we're seeing at the state level and with some of the other entities that are doing buildings that, from a governmental standpoint, that they're looking at how to implement that. So I'm 100% in favor of moving forward with this. I like the balance that you've struck between, as Commissioner Gower said from the very beginning, you're kind of striking the balance between pushing for sustainability, but recognizing that we don't want to unfairly burden the construction community. So I think it's a good place forward, and I do think it will bear looking at closely over the next year or two.
Good. I want to add, there's one thing we failed to adjust in our edits. There's still language talking about compact fluorescent lighting. We want to remove that language. That's LED. You should need LED to get those bonuses. So I just wanted to get that on the record that we'd intend to do that.
I saw that as part of the markup, but again, there was the daylighting one is the one that really jumped out at me. That isn't. It just says to implement daylighting strategies, but there's no percentage or background to how to do that.
That's a good refinement. We'd certainly support that.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Velto, if I can just make a comment and kind of ask a question.
Sure.
So I appreciate the perspective of the previous commissioners explaining the point system and how it's accessible to projects at lower costs. This really does give me a better perspective. And, as far as this portion of revising the code goes, I'm not opposed. I just really need to see some more information as to what the costs will be. And I get the financial cost society from environmental destruction. I've read these studies about climate change, healthcare. The concept of cost being more than just the dollar paid is totally valid. But to me, it's kind of a question of who pays that cost. And the person who's saving up to buy an entry-level home or who's struggling to pay rent doesn't always care about the societal cost down the road. For them, it's a question of just, do I have a place to live? So while I appreciate that perspective, I tend to evaluate societal costs generally, and maybe that's our role as a public body. But in the context of housing, when it's a basic necessity, I struggle with that form of cost-benefit analysis, even though I do understand it and I hear your perspective. So I guess here's where my question comes in is, in terms of tracking this, what kind of, teeth do we have to make changes if it turns out there are extreme costs associated with this system? And how would we review that down the road? Is this a situation where there could be, I don't know, a sunset or something along those lines to make sure that it's working?
Well, our recommendation is to have a deliberate review 6 months and again 12 months after adoption with examples. We will try to pull together kind of some cost-benefit information prior to adoption. Hopefully we can maybe get someone to help with a mock project or something to see what it means with a few different product examples. Just fair warning, we are totally buried with all things COVID, so it might not be the exhaustive analysis that may be desired by some, but we would certainly recommend and keep track of real-world examples here in Reno using this ordinance, and look at this ordinance, among other things in the code, 6 months after adoption, and again 12 months after adoption, and if necessary, continue that process.
And Arlo, if you could, the explanation that was given by Commissioner Gower and Commissioner Johnson as far as meeting that 46 points based on, say, location, if there's walkability components and whatnot, if you could maybe give an example of a project that is not what they've explained, because what they've explained totally satisfies my concerns with this. I'd be more concerned with what effect this will have on new developments that are, say, further away. That's kind of the project I want to see information about.
We'll try to pull that together. What I'm envisioning is a few sample projects, maybe an urban infill project, how they could meet it, maybe a entry-level single-family home up in the North Valleys, what that would mean for a product like that. We'll try to pull together that information for you.
Thank you.
And just to say, if the commission were to, if the housing affordability in particular, the section I'm highlighting here on the unit sizes, that could be one area you could look at. Because again, a 5,000 square foot home, they're going to be fine. They can absorb it. They're using a ton of energy already. It's those smaller houses, more entry level, where the price points are tougher.
Great. Other comments, commissioners?
Well, if I could, I really appreciate this meeting. I know it's been a long one, but this has been good feedback. If we're done on this section, I did want to briefly discuss our next steps moving forward before we move towards adjournment. Chair Taylor, Are you ready for that?
So I have some overall general comments. Do you want those now, or do you want to wait until after your presentation?
Why don't you go? I was just going to talk about the next meeting dates and things like that.
Okay, so we've had this conversation over and over and over again about outreach and public participation and how to get more participation. And I'm just going to throw out some ideas for recommendation. I think we are getting public comment, but we should have a lot more, especially when I saw today when we were going through sections and you said we haven't received a lot of comment. And I know that we've done a lot of outreach, and I'm not saying it's anybody's fault, but I think there's some tools that we might be able to implement. One is, do we use our communications and media relations to send out news releases to announce that this process is going forward and to send in comments or participate?
We do. We've probably done that 4 to 6 times through the process, and we have another one planned to go out next week.
Okay, great.
I just like to comment, it is sometimes hard to get people engaged at the zoning and development code level until there's a project next to them. This is not unusual, and oftentimes more comments come in near the end. But we did do 2 direct mail notifications inviting comments. We got more this time than last time. The summaries we gave you, we can bring to your next meeting the full list of feedback. Most of the communication we get from the public is really kind of, hey, what can I do on my property? What's my zoning? That type of thing. And that wasn't included in the summary. So Jeff may have numbers, but I know we've had several hundred folks contact us since the last mailed notice.
For Arlo, this is Jeff. Just in phone calls alone, as of yesterday, we're at about 134 since we sent the notice out. And emails are, oh gosh, I don't have a number off the top of my head, but I would say probably in the 50 and 60 range, just in emails alone.
A couple hundred.
Good. So
we're trying, and we'll keep trying. Any other suggestions?
Yeah, I think what we don't want to see is, you know, you guys get thousands of comments in November and December when we're moving towards adoption, which might happen. But I know there's the Nextdoor app where at a planning commission meeting, there was a project that we had no comments on, and then somebody posted it on the Nextdoor app at council, and there was a flood of comments. So I'm not sure if that's a possibility.
Yes.
Neighborhood postings on places where things are going to change. I don't know if the Wells Avenue and their coffee shops or posters or stuff like that, where we could do some grassroots posting of flyers. The next thing I was thinking is Facebook awareness ads per zip code where where there's going to be major changes. I'm throwing this stuff out. I don't know if it's even possible, but I'm very scared that in November or December we're going to just have a whole bunch of people coming forward saying they never knew this was happening. So I think the more due diligence we do up front, and I know we've done a lot of community outreach, I'm just saying that maybe it helps us a little bit in the end. My next overall comment was, when people are providing, or the public is providing their comments, do they get a response back to what their comment is? Because I know in the sheet that we saw, there were some in the action comments that hadn't been addressed yet, and I think it's because it was a new comment. But say, for instance, Donna has a comment, she has lots of comments. Is somebody getting back in touch with her and going over, you know, yeah, this is why it's moving this way one way or another?
Yes, we're responding to every inquiry by phone or email. I've certainly met with Donna, probably pushing towards, you know, quite a few times now. And we have some other kind of active participants who've had many, many, many communications with us. So we're getting back with everyone. We're trying to explain if we're not embracing a recommendation, why. And in particular, we're trying to work out issues, especially some of these property level concerns. So Jeff and the whole team down in planning have been quite busy since the notifications went out. Between our short staffing and budget cuts and regular work, it's quite a bit.
Sure. That's much appreciated. And then, Arlo, when I attended the community meeting earlier this week, I think you said something that was really important, and I know you've said it before. There's going to be a year process or a learning curve where you guys are going to look at something. So it's not like this is going to be adopted in November and December, and then we're never going to go and look back at it again, right?
Super important, yes. Specifically, we're planning just deliberate scheduled reviews at 6 and 12 months. And at 12 months, we'd see, hey, do we need to continue this process to actually have a scheduled thing, not just, you know, staff will bring it back at some point.
My last general comment is, my dogs are going to bark, but some people, I apologize, hold on. I've heard the comment of, why isn't there one red line version of all of the changes? And from what I've seen and understand, you know, you had a code that was like this, so it wasn't like you went through and did track changes. You basically took this and turned it into this.
We really tried to do a track change version, and it was so much more confusing than helpful, because pretty much everything's been reorganized and the words have been monetized. It was just red lines all over the place and you couldn't even follow. So that's why we use this bullet point summary of code amendments instead of kind of the red line version. It just wasn't working for the intended purpose.
Thank you so much. I know you're going to talk about your next steps, but to everybody who's been involved in this. It just is such a huge effort. And to watch you be able to go through when we had questions and click on something and bring it up was really impressive and an improvement in my mind. So thank you. Those are my general comments and questions.
Thank you. Are we ready to move into logistics for next meetings?
I think so.
So I guess the question, we're scheduled to be on your next regular meeting, but clearly we just spent 3.5 hours going through this. The basic question is, do you want to do another special meeting or take this on in a regular meeting?
Commissioners, I would say special meeting, but I'm open.
I would agree with that, Madam Chair.
Well, this Thursday worked pretty well this time. We can have Michelle kind of poll everyone for availability. We're scheduled to do this again in 3 weeks, which works well because it allows some turnaround time here. So maybe we'll target a second meeting that same week if it's workable for the commissioners. And then I also wanted to point out we do have enough time so that if you don't get through everything at your next meeting, we could bring it back to your meeting after that. That would be the late October meeting, and that would still allow your input to get to council before their scheduled meetings. So we'll shoot for a special meeting, probably 5 o'clock again, roughly 3 weeks from now. That's really all I had for next steps.
So, Michelle, do we have any public comment?
Donna's hand is raised. Do we want to do 3 minutes again? Are we done with this item, or are we going to have general public comment at the end of the meeting, or do you want to do it with this?
Let's do general public comment now.
So we're going to close this item and then go to public comment?
Well, let me ask you this. Arlo, did you need a motion for any of this, or did we decide that these are just going to be recommendations?
I do not. I think I'm pretty clear of the appetite of the commission.
Okay. So let's close this agenda item and ask if there is any general public comment.
Yes, so we have Donna Keats on the line. We'll bring her in. Donna, can you hear us?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, you have 3
Am I
minutes to make a public comment. Can you hear us?
Oh, I believe so. Yes, I can't see you really. Got my glasses. Anyway, I'm sorry if I was ranting at you before. I want to thank you again. I'm going to make another pitch for this affordability in the urban redevelopment, all of that you want to do. It's all talk and uniformity. You have these things that are not tied in the regulation. You have density bonuses. You have something else about, because to allow development on small lots, yet the regulation itself does not say anything about small lots. That's a footnote intention informational thing. So put that stuff in there. You know, if you want density bonuses to increase affordability, say so and have the city get something back for it, and do this in a manner that makes sense to, you know, for the people who currently live here and for the densification plan that's on your mind. But this piecemeal kind of not letting everybody know what's going on, and do it that way. We don't need more $450,000 townhomes in the central city, and we don't need rooftop penthouses that are excluded from building height limitations. You know, we need things people can afford. And I think there's a few places that I've brought up to you guys that you could still do something about that in a regulatory sense instead of in a fluffy, footnoted conceptual sense. So I'm asking that you consider making a recommendation to put something like that into the code when it goes to council. Workforce housing, handicap accessible, incentivize that in the urban area. You know, you can't be crippled or mobility impaired and live in Midtown. It's not possible. There's no parking. So incentivize that. make those have density bonuses so that people who are handicapped can live downtown. You know, so when I move out of my house by Virginia Lake because it's too much for me, I can move into one of those places downtown. I won't be able to once I can't walk. So incentivize that, make that happen. That's what you could do that would bring a good diversity mix of housing and population and ages, everything. You can do that stuff so you have an opportunity. So I'm just had to come back and throw that in there one more time and ask you to see if you can't find a way to make a recommendation for those kinds of things to happen. So thank you for your efforts and your time. I appreciate it, all of you. And, you know, thanks for putting up with me, reading my stuff. So, all right, I'm checking out. Have a good night. I hope you get to check out soon. My dog's good.
Thank you,
Okay,
Donna.
all right, bye. If I can find the leave button. Okay, I'm gone. Thank you.
Michelle can help you too.
And then we have Melinda Smith on the line. I don't know if she wants to make public comment, but we can bring her in.
Thank you.
Melinda?
Thank you. I don't have any additional comments at this time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, Michelle, do we have any other public comment?
No, we do not.
Okay, we will close public comment and bring it back to the commission for a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Arlo. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, IT, Brian, and Michelle. Have a great night, great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.